My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they spray our skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, and it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You'll just tell your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
Prepare to enter a world where geology as we've been taught has been flipped on its head, and entertain the notion of giant trees, stone hearts, and the massive remains of a mountain-sized elephant. Could it be that under specific circumstances, living organisms can be petrified into mineral form in an instant? Science fiction or science fact? Today's guest, Mike Wilkerson of Stellium 7, makes a compelling case for this being a fact. Suspend all disbelief with me, Mystic Mark, here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy this conversation with Mike Wilkerson of Stellium 7.
One of the best comments that I've had on my channel over the years is that someone said my videos are more powerful than psychedelics because they don't wear off. And many people have started to see things through different eyes after watching these videos. So that's cool. Take it all with a grain of salt. I could be wrong about it all, but there's so much that lines up perfectly in ways that it shouldn't, and so many synchronicities along the way that have all pointed to these things. And if I'm right about anything, then geology is grossly inaccurate about some pretty major cornerstones. And if I'm right about these things, then there needs to be another term to distinguish, at least for the time being, between geology and biogeology, which is that most of the stone that we see had biologic origins, and probably a lot more recently than we were taught.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mystic Mark, and here with me today for the first time is someone who has, in my opinion, a groundbreaking theory, no pun intended. This hypothesis is sure to shake up the way you see the earth under your feet. It's a real pleasure to have him here from Stellium 7, Mike Wilkerson. Welcome to the show, my friend. It's a pleasure to have you on. And for folks who might not be aware of your channel or your work, would you mind giving us a little introduction, a brief summary of what you are, or who you are and what you do?
Sure. The channel started about 7 years ago when I was looking into alternative takes on geology, and that followed a whole lot of other rabbit holes that got me questioning the nature of reality in a variety of different ways, and started to question whether we live in some sort of a simulation, whether this is all just illusion, if it's a physical reality, what is the nature of reality, and where do you start, and how do you make sense of that? And if it's all just a simulation, then does anything really matter? And then there's a lot of people who are of the Christian mindset, and they have a problem with the whole simulation theory idea, and they're more geared towards this as a created realm. And my take on it has always been, well, at the very least, it's a created realm in the mind of God, so it's God's simulation. So I don't really get hung up on the simulation theory much, but my approach to looking at things is what can you verify, what can you see for yourself. And so I turn to the empirical, and I know that we're, energetic beings as well as physical beings, and that everything is energy ultimately. But I think that there is a foundation to reality that is concrete, so to say. And so that's kind of how I began my studies on my channel. I've looked primarily, there's been three main themes. One has to do with titans and gigantic beings. The other has to do with along the same lines, the great trees. And when I say great trees, I don't mean like the sequoias, the biggest trees that we have today, but trees that were very likely miles wide at the base. And what is the evidence for that? Is there something more than just Devil's Tower to point to, or the various plateaus around the world that look like tree stumps? Is there more evidence than that? And that's what a lot of my channel is focused on, on topics surrounding ideas with regards to rapid petrification and the different ways in which things could petrify.
Right.
And along the way, I made discoveries of my own that have to do with a mountain here in Spain that I've gone very deep into for a couple of years of analysis, and have presented a number of videos on that subject. And there's a lot of people pointing to different stony structures around the world, or sharing photographs, and they look like faces, they look like creatures of different sorts or people. And so those are the kinds of things that sparked my curiosity initially, and caused me to look deeper into it. As professionally, I work as a chiropractor. So my schooling and my background had a lot to do with anatomy and histology, which is a study of tissues. And so that really prepped me for what I set about to do when I started to do some of these analyses, because I was looking at a lot of what we call geology and thinking, this looks a lot like biology. And why does it look so much like tissue? And why do these things resemble body parts and whatnot? And I think a lot of people who look into this, they maybe don't have the same kind of an academic background that I've had, and they're not looking at it so analytically. They're maybe more artistic types that can see patterns in things. And so there's a lot of people sharing stuff that to me is just clearly pareidolia, because there isn't and for people who don't know what that is, that's when you see something that's not what it appears to be. We can see faces and animals in clouds, doesn't mean there's an animal up there. We can see things in wood grain, and I love to view things abstractly and to see the different kinds of patterns that emerge from an artistic perspective. I do abstract art myself, and in a lot of my artwork, depending on what angle you look at it, you see different things. So if you flip it 180 degrees, you might see entirely different faces. And I think that's a lot of what's happening with people who are looking on Google Earth and are looking at different mountain structures. I think that's really what a lot of people the mistake they're making, is there isn't any deeper analysis of it. It's just an image from one angle, and maybe the shadows are hitting it just right, and the foliage is in just the right place, or a certain time of year, and it's got snow cover. These are all factors that you have to take into consideration. So, yeah, that's an intro.
Well, and it seems like your focus is on the structure, and I appreciate the clarification there, because it is easy to dismiss this entire topic on a surface level if you know only the surface level. And unfortunately, that is kind of the main bulk of the material I've found, aside from your channel, which tends to take the opposite approach. But a lot of the let's say social media posts rather that are posting these concepts is very surface level, and it unfortunately that lends this topic to be dismissed easily by maybe those who have been entrained by the system, right? And of course, creative types are just naturally opposed to the system and maybe see through those layers. And so there is truth in that, but we do need an analyst to back up those creative impulses. So yeah, very interesting. I do, before we get into the meat of the conversation, I want to just touch on something in your bio. It says in the 80s you were pursuing hackers, which is a topic that we've talked about on this show. It's something that I'm fascinated with, you know, these sort of internet renegades who are breaking all the digital rules. So how, in what way did that former life lend itself to this now passion pursuit of yours?
I wouldn't say I was pursuing hackers. I would say I was a hacker being pursued, and then eventually caught. So yeah, I was a hobbyist from like 13 to 18 when I got caught.
See, I misread it. Maybe I misread it to thinking you were like almost like a journalist approach to hacking, but no, you were a hacker yourself. Okay, wow, interesting.
I was a hacker. Yeah, yeah. I have a very unusual backstory with my history when it comes to the hacking. I started, like I said, when I was about 13. This is before the internet. This is, you know, modem dial-ups and low baud rate, and I learned a lot in a short amount of time, and then eventually I met a lot of other people who had similar interests, and we were networking and sharing information a lot the way we all do nowadays with social media. But back then, in order to do that, you had to be able to hack the phone system, and you had to know your way around a lot of different kinds of technologies to be able to do it. So I ended up making friends and traveling to meet them and doing crazy shit as a teen. And then when I was 2 weeks after I turned 18, I got busted in Seattle. I was living there briefly and I got caught, and it went to court, and I was charged with 4 counts of illegal computer trespass for breaking into Microsoft and Boeing and Sunstrand and Kenworth Trucking. Those are the 4 I was charged with. And it was kind of a big deal because this is 1985 that I was busted.
Wow.
Seattle had a new law in place, or Washington State did, and it was the most progressive law, anti-hacking law in the country. And a year later, they passed the Computer Crime and Fraud Act in 1986, which is basically is the blueprint for what we have now, where it makes it very, very dangerous to get caught for hacking because it's felony offenses and long jail time and high fines. So I was right at the beginning of that change, and the prosecuting attorney assigned to my case was the one who co-wrote the law.
Wow.
So he had a vested interest in a conviction, and they were really pushing for jail time because they wanted to send a message to teen hackers and others who thought, oh, this would be something fun to do, you know. And so I was the example that was set. I actually went to jail for hacking when I was 18, and have the dubious distinction of being the first hacker jailed for the crime of hacking.
Wow.
In the world.
Wow. Wow, that's historic.
You can look it up on Wikipedia. It's there.
Well, and how much time did you end up serving in total?
It was just 2 weeks that I was sentenced to, and
wow.
I had probation and fines and community service as well. There was a whole,
so relatively a slap on the wrist, but in the grand scheme of things, you were sort of like the poster child for what would become hacking laws, right? I mean, you kind of got maybe the lighter end of it in a way, but yeah, well, God bless you for not getting, you know, arrested a year later and being in jail, maybe possibly still to this day. I mean, we've talked numerous times about different people who are incarcerated currently for computer crimes, and it's definitely a gray area, you know, and I think the internet is such an amazing thing that, you know, to put a cap on it is really impossible at this point. I mean, there's always going to be someone figuring out a new way to hack into a new thing and figure out a new way to go, undercover and not be detected doing that. But still, to be right at the beginning of that wave must be pretty interesting for you, and also maybe a little disheartening, because you're like, oh geez, to see where hacking's come now and to be taken out of the game so quickly must be a little bit of a disappointment.
I was lucky to be taken out when I was.
Well, but it
I'm
seems
very
like
happy it went the way that it did.
Right.
It could have gone a lot worse.
Right. No, yeah, for sure. But it seems like, from what I've seen of your work, you definitely have a mind for this sort of thing that's been applied maybe to a more productive realm, and the curiosity of figuring out what's really going on in this world. But I do think that was a necessary thing to bring up, especially since we're going to be talking about the simulation, because there is I don't know if it's I don't know what it is about hacking and this idea that we can maybe it's the Matrix movie or something, in my mind, my own biases, but I do find the world we're in now has a sort of overarching programming, and it's almost like trying to segment us away from truth for whatever reason, right? And we almost need to be like hackers to hack past that mainstream status quo, what have you, programming. So I
agree. And what I was getting at before, when I was talking about empirical reality, I think the Matrix does exist and there is a simulation, but to me, it's more of it's like a psychological and digital overlay on our reality that exists parallel. So that's definitely hackable. How hackable physical reality is, I don't know, but based on how humans seem to progress, it seems to be that we're only touching on our potential as beings in general. So
right. Well, and it seems like we're working with a very limited operating system for how we're understanding our world, right? And I'm no computer programmer, so please don't attack me, audience, for how I'm using these terms. But either way, I think there's a ton of analogy in that, and when it comes to the topics we're going to be talking about today, it's probably useful for the audience to have that sort of mindset about this, that maybe the truth, the physical reality as we know it, is a lot more malleable than we've been taught. Or at least maybe we need to have a more malleable way of seeing it until we get to that more accurate way of understanding it. But when it comes to something like biogeology, where do we begin to wrap our head around this topic? Because I'm someone who's obsessed with stone structures, and one of my greatest pet research projects over the past 4 or 5 years has been looking into some of these ancient stone structures around my area and trying to figure out how they could have been built, who built them. And for the most part, there's a lot of mystery still to this day around these structures. But one of the things I started to learn is that maybe stone isn't as solid as we think it is. Like, maybe there are more ways that stone is formed than we're traditionally taught, right? So where does one begin to wrap their head around this topic of biogeology, or how you see it, at least?
Yeah, well, that term is a term that I appropriated and started to use as a distinction between mainstream geology and the narratives that we're told about how stone forms, and the kinds of things that I was discovering as I was looking deeper into these subjects and looking at alternative takes on geology and the age of things and how is that determined, and what is the real nature or origin of stone. So biogeology is a term used in science to describe the interaction between the geosphere, earth, plant and animal life, and the lithosphere. So it's like this percolating upward of really small materials that go up into the atmosphere. And it's a very little known branch of science. And so I thought, well, if there's any truth to any of the stuff that I've been sharing on my channel for the last 7 years that has to do with the big trees and the former existence of titanic creatures, rapid petrification, things like petrified organs, which I've touched on a lot on my channel because of discoveries that I personally made. All of those things, none of them can be true if the mainstream narratives for geology are true. So in order to distinguish between those two, I latched onto biogeology because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a much closer connection between biological life and stone. And even in the mainstream narrative, except for igneous rock, which is volcanic lava that cools and you can see it coming out of volcanoes, all of the stone that exists apart from that kind of stone is said to come from dead plant and animal life. And the way that works is that things die and create layers. And those layers get heavier and heavier, and eventually we get sedimentary layers. And then those sedimentary layers get heavier, and that starts to melt and morph into what they call metamorphic rock. And then take it further, and then you end up with magma and lava, and then it comes back out as volcanic activity that's got all of the elements that are needed to for life to flourish. And this is probably why the volcanic zones are the best when it comes to agriculture and the taste of food and the diversity of animal and plant life. But that's what they call the cycle of petrogenesis. It starts with igneous and then the plant life, and it's this compression under the sea floor with all that weight of water. But they're telling us that these things are taking millions and millions of years to form, and certain layers are said to be hundreds of millions of years old. And I think that based on what I've learned in the last 5 to 7 years, that's not true at all. There are many, many examples of why it's not true. And, it begs the question, how old are things and how do they really form? So I think biogeology is a good placeholder term. If geology was accurate, if I'm right about anything, then geology is grossly inaccurate about some pretty major cornerstones. And, if I'm right about these things, then there needs to be another term to distinguish, at least for the time being, between geology and biogeology, which is that most of the stone that we see had biologic origins, and probably a lot more recently than we were taught.
Yeah. And it seems like there is a inherent antiquity bias in a lot of academic subjects. Geology's a good example of one, but it layers into all sorts of topics that we talk about on this show, where archaeologists, geologists, name your scientist, they have this bias to the model that the universe is this many billions of years old, so therefore the Earth must be this many millions years old, and so on and so forth. And it does feel like mathemagics at a certain point, where they're almost, magically skewing things into a realm of equivalencies where nothing can truly be assessed, and yeah, but that's equivalent to this, so you're wrong, we're right, right? So, and a lot of again, mathemagics to justify it, and maybe it's just my limited mathematical ability, but anytime you get into the realm of gigantic numbers, it just almost feels like it's a barrier for certain few, right? So anyways, my own, limitations aside, it does seem like this is a subject that applies. The whole cycle of petrogenesis. This is interesting how these, stones form. There's almost like an acknowledgement of the actual cycle, but again, with that bias of time, it takes much longer than you think, right? In a way, this cycle of sedimentary to metamorphic, igneous, this could still be true in this model. But what we're suggesting is that biological organic materials don't have to be squeezed and compressed over millions of years. They can just petrify under certain environmental circumstances. And again, that bias, the time bias, but I want to ask you about this next bias that I'm kind of noticing in the mainstream model, which is, seems like they're almost biased towards gravity and the gravitational physics of our world, whereas your suggestion, your hypothesis, seems to be in line with something we talk about here on the show, which is an electromagnetic model of the universe, where electromagnetism and vibration and these things are more active in our physical world than our modern physics acknowledges. And maybe something like electromagnetism could be behind the petrification of a biological being, an organism. What do you think of that? Am I on the right tracks there? Am I off? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we can start with petrification. Well, actually, I'll just take it back a step, because you're talking about the different models, and heliocentric model, where they talk about a 16 plus billion year old universe, and that they know the age of because they saw the beginning of it with their telescopes. And then they tell us the Earth is 4 point something billion years old. And those models, they point at each other, right? That one is confirming the other. And we know that the universe is this old because we can look at our geological record here, and we know how old the Earth is. And so first of all, the dating techniques, there are many. I mean, if you look up dating techniques on Wikipedia, you're going to find a whole slew of them that are very complex sounding. But one of the ones we hear the most about is carbon dating, and that is said to be very inaccurate after thousands of years. And there are examples of people giving very young objects and getting very large dates back on the age of those objects. So, and each one of these different dating techniques along the way has been hotly contested. So the question is, how do they really know how old things are? And they talk about, radioisotopes and decay rates and all of this sort of stuff. Just going back to petrification, even in the mainstream model, petrification is a thing. We have petrified forests that you can go visit and walk around the trees and buy a little bit of one. And those are said to have taken 200 million years roughly to form. And the way that happens, according to the mainstream, is through what's known as permineralization, where the tree or whatever it was that was petrified is surrounded in a material, mud, salt water, mix of the two, ash, volcanic activity. And the elements that are in that surrounding material are over long periods of time working their way in, while the gases and the fluid that are inside of whatever it is that's petrifying works its way out. And that is what's known as permineralization. And that process with the trees, we're told, takes 100 million years. But it's very far-fetched when there are scientists that have literally, in the space of a day, 24 hours, created petrified wood in laboratories that's indistinguishable from naturally occurring petrified wood under a microscope. There was a test that was done where they took 7 different pieces of wood and they dropped them into hot volcanic waters, high mineral content waters. And after one, they removed one after each year. And by the time they got to the 7th one, it was fully petrified. So to say that something takes hundreds of millions of years to petrify, when we can do it artificially, we can create all kinds of things in laboratory settings that, according to what I grew up learning about geology, shouldn't really be possible. Like, take a diamond, for example. They tell us that 1 million years of pressure, or 1 million pounds of pressure for 1 million years on coal creates a diamond. But, you can create artificial diamonds. There's a video on my channel where a guy has created rubies using a microwave. And he's mixed 2 different kinds of powder together, and the magnetron in the microwave creates plasma. And he puts the powders inside of a votive with, I think, a little steel wool and a little ceramic top on it, and turns on the microwave, and within 10 seconds he's creating raw rubies. Now, these aren't the kind of rubies you would sell on the market. Otherwise you can make a fortune, with your microwave. But they fluoresce just as you should with, I guess it's UV light or black light or something. They're clearly rubies that he's creating. It's from a channel with, I can't remember the name of it. It's got like 1.5 million subs. And he just shows you how to do it right there and tells you what the chemical constituents are. Well, ruby is number 2 on the hardness scale after diamond. So that's pretty wild that you can create something that hard from powder in a microwave in seconds. So what else is possible when you start to consider pyroclastic flows, which are when a volcano erupts, 1,500 degrees of temperature at their max, moving at the speed of sound. That's a lot of power. Could potentially, do a lot of damage to things. You've got plasma, which is, what's happening in the microwave on a small scale, but a plasma storm, where do we see the biggest plasma storms? Overactive volcanoes, because the volcanic ash is a wonderful conductor for it all. So yeah, there's lots of examples when you look at the Earth from above on Google Earth of what they call Lichtenberg figures, which are basically like fractal-like patterns, like looks like the way a tree grows or the lungs, that branches out like lightning. And they're actually, when lightning strikes things, it creates this fractal pattern. I've got some video clips I can show later of, just putting electrodes on wood, it creates this fractal burn across the wood, and when you look at Lichtenberg figures of the Earth, it sure looks like the Earth got hit by a major plasma event at some point. And as far as models go, I don't have a model. I'm a globe skeptic, definitely. I think that electric and models that incorporate electric and plasma and magnetics, and if anything, we might live inside of a toroid for all I know. I don't assert a model. I'm not attached to a particular model. Ultimately, I'm more interested in what can we prove, and what proving things, as you alluded to before, is very tricky. How do you get to the truth? And I like the neti principle. You've probably heard of that. And it's not this, not that. So the more you dig into things and you find out, oh, that's not true, the more you can take off the table, sooner or later you're going to be left with something that hopefully resembles the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there, and that's a great place to start too. So when it comes to this plasma event on the Earth, I've seen places like the Grand Canyon shown in like parallel with this Lichtenberg pattern. I've seen that before, and I'm curious, is that the major example of where this has occurred on the Earth? Are there other places? Is this something, when we look at structures of mountains, mountain ranges, do they resemble this pattern, or is it certain ones where these events have taken place?
Yeah, the Grand Canyon would be the biggest example of a Lichtenberg figure. I think it's it's kind of absurd to think that small little tiny rivulets just formed in this fractal pattern and then they all converge into this one river that goes down. I think it's far more likely that water is flowing where the Lichtenberg pattern happened, because those are easy channels for it to follow. Yeah, and as far as the Earth itself, you can see a lot of things that look like that fractal pattern, but they may actually be root structures, because in my world, the trees are proven unequivocally, and I can show some visual evidence for that. A lot of people are hung up on Devil's Tower. Is it a tree stump? Is it not? Some people are saying it's a tendon. Others are saying it was a form of mushroom known as stemonitis, or it's one of those mysteries that we may never know. Someone apparently took LiDAR to the region and discovered a root structure, but I've never been able to find that study anywhere. So whether that actually happened or that's true, I don't know. But aside from the obvious tree-looking plateaus around the world, which are often flat, which beg the question, why are they flat? Who took them down? How did they take them down? What technology was used? Which gets into mythological kinds of tales as well, because now if those kinds of creatures and trees once existed, then our religious tales and our mythological tales are a lot closer to our true history than the heliocentric history that we've been given.
Right. Can we get into some examples of those? Because one that comes to mind is maybe not so mythical in the sense of age. It's more of a folk tale, I think we would consider it. But Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox, this idea that there were giants here in America is very pervasive, whether you're talking about skeletal giants that are found underground or these giant locales that could have supported huge beings, right? Like giant tree stumps. But talk about this Paul Bunyan and the blue ox, because unless I'm misremembering this, wasn't he cutting down trees? Like, wasn't that a part of the story?
A mountain-size lumberjack,
Right.
with a big blue ox as his buddy, and I mean they were the size of mountains, not giants, like with not 15-footers or 20-footers or 50-footers, but many, hundreds of feet high,
Right.
towering above the trees and cutting them down. And that's one of many tales. We have Jack and the Beanstalk. We have lots of mythical tales. And in Greek mythology, you have Medusa, which was this gorgon that could turn things to stone just by looking at them. She had snakes for her hair, and you've got Cthulhu, the Phoenix myths. Dragons may be a metaphor for this because, a dragon plasma looks serpentine in the sky. So there's a lot of people that talk about things like the plasma apocalypse or the Phoenix event or the electromagnetic changeover plasma event or something, EMCO. There are lots of theories that have been bandied about. And I think they have merit when you start to look at a more electric model of the universe. I often refer to the Primer fields, which are, these mind-blowing studies that were done by a guy with these magnets that are shaped kind of like the dome of the Pantheon, and they're opposing each other inside of a gas chamber, and they're suspended using strings and magnets, and electrical current is run through these magnets, and the chamber is filled with different noble gases, and it creates all of these different plasma events just based on which kind of gas you're using, how much current is being put through it, the position of the magnets. And so those are really interesting. And you tie that into the works of somebody like Ken Wheeler, Theoria Apophysis, with his discoveries regarding the ferrocell and visualizing the magnetic field. Everything seems to have this toroidal shape. And so I think that there's a lot more to be learned looking at those models. And you mentioned gravity before. Gravity's the main, two things. One, they say that these are just myths that have no basis in fact and no geological record, which is absolutely not true. And then the other is that they couldn't possibly have existed because they would be too big and they would have collapsed under their own weight. But those narratives are based on our mainstream thought regarding gravity and what makes things go down, which is a very deep subject in and of itself. But I think that it's pretty obvious that things like electrostatics are it's easier to explain what's happening as far as, experimentally in laboratories with electrostatics. And even in the mainstream model, the electrostatic force, which, is 10 to the 30th stronger than the supposed strong force of gravity. But the point is that there's a law known as the square cube law, that as something grows in size, its mass increases dramatically, to the point where it would be so big that it wouldn't be able to hold its own weight. It would break its own bones. And that would be true if you have, a bending of space-time, which is our current model, mass attracting mass. But I don't think that's what's happening. And I don't think the realm is what we were taught either. So, everything's up for grabs when it comes to this stuff. And that's why I really focused more on what's provable, what can we see, what can we touch, what can we examine, rather than just looking at pictures on the internet. Like, get out there and look at stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, within an electrostatic model, we were just talking about this with Mark Gober and his An End to Upside Down Cosmos book.
Shout out to Mark.
Yeah, really interesting guy, really smart, has his, money is in the right place as far as like pointing out where these fallacies are with the mainstream model. I think it leaves a lot of room for truth to be found in what we're suggesting here, which from the traditional, or not traditional, from the status quo model, it's like, whoa, you're telling me that mountains are actually trees. What? Right? It's just like, it seems like a huge leap, but when you consider that science is kind of, in a way, telling us that in the past the earth was different and it could support great, huge forms of life, right? This whole thing with the dinosaurs. So in one sense, they are kind of admitting that there's some truth to this, right? And we've had somebody on the show talking about the Saturn hypothesis, and somewhere in there, there's also the idea that the earth's atmosphere was more like ice at some point. Maybe it still is.
This idea of the vapor canopy. Have
Right,
you heard of that term?
right.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so the sun and the moon were no longer, they weren't visible in the sky because there was a suspension of micro droplets of water that were suspended in the air, and so light was diffused. It wasn't direct light like we get from the sunlight. Things were much bigger then.
Right. Wouldn't it have had
probably bioluminescent as well?
Wouldn't it have had like a sort of greenhouse effect where things would have gotten a lot larger? So we would have had maybe giant scale trees like the kind we're maybe finding the remnants of now.
Well, if you have increased atmospheric pressure and increased concentrations of oxygen and carbon or CO2, you get gigantism in plant life and probably animal life as well. So we're talking about, pre-flood era. There have been multiple cataclysms. People talk about the mud flood. People talk about a lot of different potential time periods when things happened. And even in the mainstream, you got the dinosaurs dying 65 million years ago as a result of a comet strike. But I think the take home there is that even the mainstream model is acknowledging the existence of megaflora and megafauna in the fossil record, and talking about insects that were 100 times bigger than they are now, or different creatures. You've had Analog on your show, right?
Yeah.
A good friend of mine, Ben. So much of his work has dovetailed with the discoveries that I've made. And he's been feeding me articles off and on for years of different, examples of petrification and gigantism that were in the newspapers from the 1880s to the 1920s, before the Rockefellers took over everything and changed medicine and changed education. And we got the propaganda system that we have today. It seems like the articles were far more real and down to earth and matter of fact on the reporting, that he's cataloged so beautifully over the last decade. And Mark Gober, he's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. I got the chance to meet him at Music and Sky this year, and he's spot on with his analyses as well when it comes to, he's written 7 books now on the upside down world. So I think all of the ologies in one way or another have been compromised, and they serve the people that are doing the compromising.
Yeah. It's unbelievable the gap between those who see the world one way and see the world another way. I mean, so there's a whole group of people who would listen to this conversation and think, oh my gosh, they're so brainwashed. Meanwhile, we know they're brainwashed, right? And it's this whole cognitive dissonance that's being created. And I don't know. I think it's dangerous, because there was a time when I would have taken all of the stuff you talk about and said, oh, that's just crap, But I took a moment, I took a breath, I looked at some of my audience. They were telling me, hey, you should look into this. And I started looking into it more and more. And it just seems to fit into a more congruent pattern of how life organizes itself with this fractal nature, right? So again, it's something that I think is very important, but it requires a major shift in the way you see the world, not only on a physical level, but the physics paradigm needs to shift, and all these other things that come with that understanding. But now that we're there, something like a giant, we had actually in relation to this topic, we had Bibu Dev Misra on the show, who talked about how 20,000 years ago, cranial capacity was 20% larger. And this is something that fluctuates over time. Now, I don't know where that fits into, what model it fits into, but either way, there's an acknowledgement that human beings themselves would have been more giant than we are now. Again, maybe not on that 100-foot scale that we're talking about with some of this, but still much larger than we are today. So where do you see human beings fitting into this whole hierarchy? Like, were we at some point side by side with these mega giants the same way like we have maybe like fairies and gnomes that are in comparison much smaller than us? Like, were we, akin to them in that way? And again, like dragons as plasma, like what, let's start to fill out like what the world was like before we took a lot of the magic out, for lack of a better term.
Well, I think dragons as physical beings could also have existed. I think there's probably more evidence for that than for the dinosaurs ultimately. I mean, there seems to be a lot of hoaxery surrounding dinosauria. And as far as the giants go, you were talking about larger brain capacity, and I was just thinking about some of these skeletons that have been found. They have, the conical heads, but they also are lacking what's known as a sagittal suture, which is, we have this line going through the middle of our cranium that separates our right and left hemisphere. Those skulls don't have that. So they had I don't know if this ties into the whole bicameral mind thing, if it was an actual physical difference, but the idea that they had one hemisphere and one sphere, I guess you would say, instead of a hemisphere, and it seems when you look in the past that they were firing on more cylinders than we are when it comes to the architecture and everything. So it's fascinating. People ask me a lot, how old are things, or did we exist side by side with them? I don't know. I think that when we see movies like Avatar, there's a wonderful music video by Pink Floyd called Mudmen, and it's basically a bunch of little tiny people that are on the back of a creature that is a mountain that just gets up and walks around, and their lives are all a mess until the creature lays down again and goes back to sleep, and then they can go about their business. And it's just little, I don't know. I think this stuff, it could be just fantasy and or metaphor, or it could be little truth drops that are giving us clues about what the past was really like.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, you mentioned something before about petrification in mineral water, and I've seen the argument made that certain works of art, classical works of art, particularly maybe from the Egyptian world, the Greek world, would be so precise that maybe instead of thinking of these sculptures as carved by tool and hand, that maybe they're actually petrified human beings who were then maybe, at the point of death, petrified to be preserved in this way as, living sculpture. It's not too far off from what certain cultures do today with, what do you call it? The, formaldehydes and such when you preserve a body and after death, and embalming. Thank you. So yeah, is this at all possible? Like something like that? Could you achieve something like that, a petrification of a human that would preserve their physical features like that?
Short answer is yes. There's two Italian scientists from the 1800s. One is named Girolamo Segato, and the other is Paolo Gorini, that knew how to petrify any kind of flesh. So their secrets died with them. It probably involves infusing the material with silica, maybe heat. I'm not sure what the techniques were, but there are museums that still exist that have their petrified works in them. I can show a little clip later. I'll just some of these different things that we're touching on now, I'll just breeze through them later in some video clips. But the museums are still there, and you can see everything from petrified, feet, breasts, organs. They're all there still. As far as the sculptures go, I've thought about that a lot. I think that a lot of what we're seeing is probably geopolymers, and that the geopolymer capabilities were far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. I think a lot of the megalithic architecture around the world isn't coming from quarried stones and then moved to its location, but are probably being poured and set on site. It would be far easier to do things as geopolymers than to cut big blocks of stone and transport them. And the underlying materials are going to be coming from nature anyway. So if you want to make granite, bust up granite and then reassemble it somewhere else, probably. There's also, I went to a place called the Gypsoteca in northern Italy, which is where they have the prototypes for the great sculptures are there. Some of the most famous sculptures in Italy. The original model that was used is made out of chalk. They carve it out. That's why it's called Gypsoteca. Gyps is chalk. And they tap these little nails into it so that they can use the nails for measurements. And, there are all these incredibly complex techniques that are used to make these things. And they could have also carved them out of something softer and then poured it as a mold. It could also potentially be petrifying wood. So I think that a lot of stone is formerly wood, and they have ways of doing that, or had.
When life's song falters in the night and courage seems to drown, hymns lifts your spirit anew so desires can fully abound. For strength and passion to reign supreme when love's dance calls to play, hymns offers remedies that ignite your flame and help extend your stay. If dormant flames in passion's den leave your heart feeling withdrawn, hymns fuels the fire with ease and care, reviving where it's gone. When tailored cures to fan the spark, no doctor's door you need to seek, reclaim your confidence and zest through hymns' discreet technique. For men who face such silent storms within the heart's domain, hymns ushers comfort quietly with solutions that remain. Wholly online, bespoke to you, removing burdens, lightening strain. Renew yourself with whispered ease. Let passion's song again be free. Start your free online visit today at hymns.com/crazy. That's HIMS.com/crazy for your personalized ED treatment options. hymns.com/crazy. The featured products include compounded products which are not approved nor verified for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for details, restrictions, and important safety information. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. Hey everybody, really quick, I want to tell you about BrainSupreme.co's Black Friday sale. Use the promo code CRAZY25 for 25% off your order at BrainSupreme.co. Elevate your perspective with Brain Supreme. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a quick break to thank our sponsors. And I just have to point out, recently we got a commenter that said, I don't like this new model where you have ads and you split the show up in half. That's not the new model. That's the case for certain episodes. And as a matter of fact, the episodes aren't even split in half. You get an hour and a half, about an hour and a half, and then a bonus extension to the episode. And I'm working out the kinks, okay? It's not perfect. And I'm not exactly making enough money on Patreon to not do the ads. So if we had 500 people instead of 224 on the Patreon, then the ads will probably disappear forever. So let's just set that goal right now. We're going to get 500 people supporting the Patreon, and then we'll think about whether or not we can take the ads off the podcast. But right now, we're just not getting enough support from the listeners as far as the Patreon goes. So sign up on the Patreon if you want every episode of the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast in its entirety, ad-free and interruption-free. Help support me. It's only $5 a month. What are you spending your money on that you can't afford? $5 a month for your favorite podcast. You love the podcast enough to comment about it, so take a little bit of that time to sign up on the Patreon at patreon.com/MFTIC. All right, folks, that's all I got for this one. We're going to thank our sponsors in the outro and in next episode's mid-roll. But until we get 500 people on the Patreon, we're keeping the ads. And as far as I'm concerned, the sponsors are not ads. So that is what it is. Shout out to the Hit Kit. Shout out to Brain Supreme. Shout out to Raw Optics. Shout out to Oregonite. And we are right back to this episode with Mike Wilkerson. Sign up on the Patreon. What are you waiting for? Patreon.com/MFTIC. $5 a month. You keep this show going. Wow, so that really changes the way we see certain architecture in that case, right? If some of these architectural features might be, geopolymer or petrified wood, it would maybe explain how some of these structures were built without the mega construction equipment that we're familiar with today, right? I mean, this kind of takes away some of the issues you have with like weight loading and carrying weight and all this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And for something like the pyramids, were those hewn blocks that were then transported, or did they just make them on site? Like we're pouring concrete nowadays. Analog has a lot of stuff on that sort of thing. There's a 2-part series by a YouTube channel called Observation Deck that's all about geopolymers. That's really worth watching because he's uncovered old texts where they're actually showing recipes and how they could make marble and granite and different things that we consider metamorphic rock that only comes from these very long, geological processes that I discussed earlier, that they were actually able to make that kind of stone as well. I think they can probably make anything or could.
Well, let's switch gears to the larger scale stuff, because before we started recording, I asked you if you had ever heard of Sleeping Giant Mountain, right? And I've come across this before because I guess there's other sleeping giant mountains in the world, and you just reminded me of that when I realized that you possibly are thinking of a different sleeping giant mountain. So the sleeping giant mountain I'm familiar with is in Hamden, Connecticut, and it has a Native American legend associated with it that involves thunderbirds, which I've always, since learning about, petrification in this more sophisticated way, I've started to wonder maybe this thunderbird component of the sleeping giant story is telling us more than just, this sort of mythical explanation for pareidolia. Maybe there's an actual event that's being recorded in this myth where 2 giant brothers get into a battle with a thunderbird, and one falls to his death, and it has now been remembered as the Sleeping Giant Mountain, right? So it's like, and you can drive up I-90, and as you're driving out of New Haven towards Hamden, you can see in the north there's a mountain with a very distinct shape of a man lying on his back. It's like a very distinct, what is that called? Supine, right? You have the head, the chest, and then feet, and the slope of the legs. I mean, it's very, with the trees and all that, it doesn't exactly look like a sleeping giant, but you can imagine in the past, maybe when there was less change to the landscape and such, it maybe looked more like a giant. So yeah, again, this is something that apparently occurs in more than just one place. And I've even seen on your channel an elephant shaped mountain, which I think is absolutely fascinating, especially considering the whole history of elephants in that part of the world. We have Hannibal and all the myths around his elephants that would come through from northern Africa into Spain, right? So talk to us about this. Is this the mountain you're referring to before that you sort of have made a lot of discoveries around?
Sure, we can start there. I'll share some images here on the screen.
Cool.
If you like, and it's easier to show this than to.
For our listening audience, if you want the video, it's always going to be on the Patreon and the Substack first. Sign up on the Patreon or the Substack to see the entire video. Now, yeah, thank you for sharing this, Mike.
I'll just jump straight into the mountain here real quick. So this is a mountain in the town that I live in Spain. And when I first was introduced to these ideas that maybe Titans were more than mythology, I immediately started to think about this mountain that I've been hiking on for years, because it's known as the elephant. Looks like a elephant lying on its stomach. Other people think it looks like other things, but many of the locals refer to it as the elephant. It's known as Montgo in Spain. And so when I was introduced to the idea, I decided to just, look into it for the fun of it. And I got on Google Earth and I started looking at it from different angles, and I could see that it had a head shape and that there were, let's see, turn on my pointer here, and that there were cutouts on the sides where a neck would have been. There's an eye socket right where it should be. Even looking from above, you can make out what appears to be a rib cage in the body. There's a big crevice between the legs, and I just thought of it as a fun topic. It wasn't anything I was taking seriously, but the more I looked, the more I found. And after about an hour on Google Earth, I had like 10 different anatomical features that lined up with the macro anatomy of the mountain. And I thought, well, okay, this is a little too much. Don't open your mind too far and let your brain fall out. And so I decided to approach it as an intellectual exercise and get out my anatomy books and start to make a list of what I would expect to find if there was any truth to the idea. And one of the first things that happened when I did that was I realized that the eye socket of the mountain was actually matching up anatomically with what you would expect to find if it were an elephant. So this is an elephant's skull here, and this is the eye socket, and then this is the temporal muscle would sit here. That's one of the two main chewing muscles. And then there's this hole right here that goes between the eye socket and the front of the face of the elephant, and there's one on each side. And that hole in humans is known as the infraorbital foramen, and it sits right here on us. But in an elephant, it's further over to the side. So this creature looks like it's on its stomach with its head tilted back, which would put this hole right exactly in front of the eye socket. And you can see that it's actually got the shape of the orbital of an eye. And here's this cave that I'm talking about, and here you can actually look through it. So right off the bat, I was finding a whole bunch of very specific anatomical features that were lining up. Here in the eye socket, if you look at the bones, like this is human obviously, but you can see there's yellow and orange here, and where these bones are meeting, this is known as a suture line. And so you've got the optic fissure where the optic nerve goes, and then you have these channels going down. And those channels they tilt down at like a 45-degree angle, and you'll see a photograph in a moment that's showing that's exactly what the inside of the cave looks like. So there's this line here that's exactly where it should be to match up with the anatomy inside the eye. So on that first visit, I was looking at this stuff, and I had already compiled inside the eye socket 10 different anatomical features. And that number's grown to almost 20 now. And that's a big number. And, you know, when it comes to games of chance and rolling dice, the odds of finding that many very specific anatomical features that match up are really slim. And you can see here, this is an elephant skull, and this is that line I was talking about between the frontal bone, the upper bone, and this lower bone here, the maxilla. And this is that exact location in the cave. And you can see it's two different stones that are overlapping. It's not a crack in the stone. And then where you would expect to find an eyeball, there's this cresting like structure that sticks up. And this is where the optic nerve would be. That's the optic fissure. And that's in the exact same location as this inside the cave. So these are incredibly specific and demonstrable. And is it just random chance? And then there's a lot of blocks here at the bottom, which you can't see in this photograph, but this hangs over, and there's no broken structure on the inside of this cave. So there's nowhere those blocks could have come from except from this structure here, which I hypothesize is the remains of the eyeball. And then without realizing it, I decided to go looking for an ear socket, or, you know, an ear canal, because on the mountain from Google Earth and with the naked eye, I could see this quarter moon shape. And so I hypothesized that if the eye was so well preserved on this side of the mountain, then and you have this shape that looks like it was an ear attachment, then maybe there'd be a cave there. And what I didn't know at the time is that there's actually a cave there, and a team of archaeologists have taken ropes and gone up to this 375-meter mark, and they've gone in and done the most amazing job analyzing the cave. They've found they've done 3D mapping of the inside of the cave. They've gone with 3D cameras to do fly-throughs. They found bodies up there. They excavated the skeletons. There's cave paintings, and so this is just a little short summary of a lot of the different threads that I just talked about related to the mountain. That sounds about. So this is up on the mountain looking down, and this is really interesting. This stone is limestone. It's a special kind of limestone known as karst, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the interesting thing about this is in the mainstream geological narrative, we're told that karst is made out of bone, and I'll explain why in a moment. But just getting back to some more about the eye socket. So this is that cresting section. This is what the backside of an eyeball looks like, and the optic nerve. And one of the things that I hypothesized early on is that anything that is fat in the body will petrify to quartz. And I can show some reasons for that. But basically, if you think of long-chain fatty acids, anything like almond oil, egg whites, salmon, like fish oils, omega-3 fish oils, all of those have this yellow hue to them. And if all the water's removed, what you're left with is these long-chain fatty acids that are essentially crystalline. Same goes for blood plasma as well. If you remove all the red blood cells and all the water, you're basically left with crystal. And the interesting thing about this is I went up to this cave with some friends of mine, Andreas Exertus and Victor Buge, who came to visit. And one of them noticed that this structure, now we're up on this structure. This is the back side of that, and this is the high point right there. And this entire layer here is one thick layer of quartz crystal, and this is what it looks like. And so that lined up absolutely perfectly with the theory as well. And then after I went into this subject in depth, I did a 6-part series called Unveiling a Titan. The first one is just an overview. The second one has to do with the eye. The third one is about the ear. The fourth one is about the tissues of the mountain. And the fifth is going back up. And when we made this additional discovery about the eye socket or the eyeball itself and the blood vessels and this quartz layer, it just lined up perfectly with the theories. So after I made a number of videos about it, I was in an interview and Google Earth had changed, and basically the eye and the ear were edited out of Google Earth. And this is what it looked like initially. I was using it as a drone because you're not allowed to fly drones there. So I was using Google Earth to pan around and to get these different angles. And then after I'd made 4 videos on the subject and done a number of interviews, this is what it looked like here, down to the right.
Huh.
And when you zoom in close, too close to see the whole mountain, the eye slowly opens up, but it remains closed when you're further away. So it's just one of those things. And so I mentioned limestone. This is the mainstream narrative. It's sedimentary rock composed mainly of skeletal fragments of marine organisms such as coral, forams, mollusks, shellfish, exoskeleton, and they're all compressed over hundreds of millions of years with these crystal forms of calcium carbonate. Well, the interesting thing about that is that's exactly what bone is made out of, right? And if you look all over the mountain, you'll find these limestone areas that are filled with all these holes and red earth and iron ore. And you can see that this is, let's see, is this video? Yeah. So this is said to be formed by water erosion, where water's coming down and rivulets are being created as it's worn away in the rock. And then those rivulets get bigger and bigger. But to me, this looks incredibly biological. I struggle to see how water could erode in this fashion, because what's happening is these channels are opening up and they're bifurcating and they're going in different directions, just like blood vessels would, or not just blood vessels, but also bone. And if you look at the structure of bone, this central portion here, this is what's known as trabecular bone. This is what it looks like under a microscope. It looks like Swiss cheese.
Wow.
So you've got basically 2 different kinds of bone on the mountain. Or 2 different kinds of stone, limestone. You have thick blocks, which are layered on top of each other with very few holes in them. And when there are holes, they're usually larger, which is exactly what you see here when you look at the structure of what they call compact bone. This is the strong portion of the bone. And then inside of our long bones and our skull and our pelvis, we have these areas where the red blood cells are being produced, and they're being produced in this trabecular bone matrix. And so all over the mountain, it's made of this limestone, and there's basically 4 components that you find on the mountain. And that's red earth. Iron ore is caked all over these different stones or in the channels, and then loads and loads of quartz crystal. So this all lined up perfectly with all the theories that I had pretty early on after I started looking into this. So part 6, I go into the microscopy and start looking at, I debunk the mainstream narrative, where they're telling us that these things are made of coral and mollusk and shellfish and whatnot. Those are not visible to the naked eye, and they're not visible with a 1000x microscope, which I took out there. So there's no hint in any of this stone of coral, shellfish, mollusk. And then, if there were, it would debunk the theory that this is bone from a larger creature. So these are the coincidences that I amassed after basically 2 years of looking into this subject. And so I can pause there. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, lots of questions. That's a great list you have there. Maybe I'll ask you to pull it back up in a moment. But yeah, well, my first thought is, it seemed like what you were just showing us there was all beat up. And I'm wondering, maybe there was a period in time where these things were more obvious, and maybe there was some sort of, group of people of some capacity who went around and destroying these things, or maybe the nature of whatever cataclysm destroyed these beings was so violent that, it destroyed them down to the very, molecule.
I think it could be both, and the reason for that is well, also the tree evidence. There's a lot of to suggest that the trees were taken down and were in varying states of decomposition before the petrification occurred. And I would cite like the dwellings in places like, what is it, Mesa Canyon, where they've carved into these sandstone, and there's, deep tunnels in these dwellings that have been created. Ben has talked about that a lot on his channel as well. So I think that rather than using primitive tools to carve into stone, I think it's far more likely that once the trees were brought down, that they were still carving into the wood and making use of it for their dwellings. And then eventually, whatever the cataclysm was hit, and that turned it to stone, completed the process. There was something else I was going to say about that, but I lost it.
It makes me think of, our idea of the Flintstones in the Stone Age, and this idea that man used to live in stone huts or something like that, which, aside from maybe dolmens and these other stone structures, I wonder, again, I think maybe your thought was about them covering this up, beating up these structures somehow to make them look less anatomical. Because
that's what it was. Thank you. Yeah, you reminded me of what I forgot. So in this region, which is, it's a fairly large region, like anywhere 50 miles in any direction from where I am, all of the mountains are covered basically from the valley floor up to where it gets too steep to, move around easily, are covered in limestone terraces. And some of these terraces are multiple feet wide. So basically what you can see is there's one side of the stone. If I go back to the screen share again here real quick, this one that I showed here, can you see that?
Yeah. Okay.
So this is the unbroken side of the stone. As I walk around it, you can see that it's fragmented in other. You can see the breaks, like this is broken here, and where it's broken, it's red. And let me try and skip ahead here. There we go. Yeah, so here you can see that's all broken and fragmented. So one side of the stone has a smooth organic feel, and when you look at it up close, it looks like blood vessels. Here you can see the iron ore that's caked to it. So this is consistent with bone, blood, plasma, which would be the quartz crystal, which it's all over the place. So you have these panels going in. So basically, the entire region is covered in these terraces. You can't even fathom how many of them there are. Oops. There. No. Trying to shut it down. Stop. There we go. Yeah, so the answer to your question is yes, both. The cataclysm and also after the fact, all of that smooth stone is broken up. That's what my point is, that it had a very organic look to it, and when you look closely, there's all these what appear to be micro blood vessels going through the stone. Then you have these channels going in, which bifurcate into other directions, which doesn't make any sense from a water erosion perspective. And and all of that stone, for the most part, has been broken up and piled into little rows. And the amount of agriculture that was in this region back in its heyday, I mean, maybe 1% to 2% of the terraces are being used right now. It boggles the mind how vast it was, and it's not being used right now.
Well, and isn't limestone an important material ingredient for multiple different things? Obviously, I think lime is a part of concrete, right? They grind up limestone and use it in concrete. So maybe,
Geopolymer.
yeah, well, and maybe there's some, again, this like feedback loop where, it's being covered up because of how useful it is without telling us why it's so useful or how it connects to human beings inextricably, which makes me think of a conversation I had with Peter Shampoo, who is like a ley line savant and goes around and using dowsing. He's mapped out all these different ley lines around the earth. And one of the patterns he's noticed through this process is that limestone over and over and over again is used in great landmarks of all sorts of different levels of significance, particularly sacred sites, and then, down to politically important sites. I mean, they all incorporate limestone in some shape or form. So it's like an unspoken significance to limestone in our human society.
Yeah. Yeah, and where limestone is found, you've also got quartz, and the piezoelectric effect is is there as well. So I'm of the mind that the old worlds, when people are looking at Tartaria, these incredible structures that are on every continent and in far too big numbers for it to make sense from what we've been told about history. That much of that stuff was built from materials harvested from the great trees and titanic beings. I think that was their source material. And a lot of people ask, well, why would they lie about this? This is so fantastic. If it was true, why would they mislead us about this? And I think that, one, it doesn't fit in with Earth shape theories. It doesn't fit in with heliocentrism. It doesn't fit in with the mainstream geological narratives. But it does fit in with hiding really useful information if you wanted to, say, have an edge when it comes to knowing where the good resources are. So if you know that something was once a tree or once a being and you can recognize it, most people are blinded to it. I call it paradigm blindness, because even experts are blinded to things because they grow up in their academia and they have, they think they're knowledgeable about something, but they might not realize that the basic foundations of their entire ology and what they've been taught are resting on flimsy ground. And so they're going to be fitting everything they see into that narrative that they've been taught. So they're blinded by their paradigm. I mean, we've all, in my opinion, been blinded by our paradigms. When we look at stones, we might see something, go, wow, that looks really biological. That looks like it was once of this or once of that. And then we go, oh no, that's not possible because we've been told these stories about petrogenesis and how they come about.
Yeah. Now, on the point, going back to the elephant, I'm curious, does the other side of the mountain have the same features? Has that side of the mountain maybe been exposed to more erosion than the other? Like, because I'm wondering, with anatomical structures, there's a symmetry that you can also notice that might be telling something, right?
That was an initial question I had, and I'll go back to just showing this image I showed before. Where is it? There we go. So if you see here, this head shape from here, oh no, my pointer, where's my laser pointer? There it is. So the head is here. And from this whole section of the mountain has collapsed. So there's a mainstream geological survey of this is a national park, and it's available online. And they talk about this area as being what's known as a synclinal. So the layers of strata are curving down here, which is indicative of a collapse. So if there was a left ear and a left eye that would have been here, they're no longer there. So that's, it's a shame. There is a cave that has a water supply in here, which is interesting. And then, the spine and the rib cage is just something that is apparent if you look at it. Combined with all the other the other things that are lining up with this, if the eye and the ear were there, it would be a slam dunk, obviously, the other side, but such is life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm curious, at the rate in which these things decay, or if there's other aspects to the stone that might explain why, the elephant was maybe curving to that side, or maybe it's just the coincidence of where it happened to die. But now we're shifting through a bunch of images of what look like the remnants of trees, right?
Yeah, I just thought I would show some things while we're talking, just to a lot of this is circulating around Instagram and TikTok, and loads of people are showing things. But what I've done in a number of my presentations on my channel, particularly the live streams, is bring all of these different data points together and show how, when you see them all as a gestalt, it's very compelling. Any one of these things in and of itself is not proof, and I'm not suggesting that it is, but this is what we were talking about before. These ancient cosmological models were all cosmic egg models, that the Earth was, we have the mythologies of the great world tree. This is Norse mythology. And there are a lot of theories about, the shape of the Earth that are bouncing around right now. But this is what a lot of people think of when they think of the great trees. And I'm undecided about this. It could be that is formerly tree, but it might not be. The mainstream tells us that it was formed as molten rock cooled to form from a liquid to a solid form, and it began to contract. And then that cooling gave rise to these hexagonal shapes, which are like a honeycomb. And the problem I have with that is that this is what lava looks like. You never see a straight line anywhere in lava. It's all amorphous, and they can't show us, even though we have active volcanoes, they can't show us this happening. There's no examples of in-between phases. And then we look at things like this, and it makes even less sense. Like, how does this kind of a line form from cooling lava? And then how do you get the hexagonal shapes inside of larger hexagonal shapes? This looks far more like something that grew to me than something that formed from cooling lava.
Right.
And then you get swirls as well. This looks far more like the grain of something that grew to me than something. I lived in Hawaii for a while. I used to climb around on the lava flows, the cooled ones. And the mainstream model is kind of laughable, in my opinion. Once again, they're talking about like 15 million year time periods, and there are basically like four main theories, and they all involve this volcanic lava flowing up, and the Earth's level was originally up here. And so that created this pressure, and then there was a rapid cooling, and then over the course of 50 million years, all of these other sedimentary layers have worn away. And my question is, well, if all that Earth was up to here, where did that Earth go? And they can't witness this happening. These are just theories. And it begs the question, how did they come down if they were trees? And that ties into what we were talking about before, and mythology, these different texts, the Book of Enoch. This is the one that I thought you were referring to, the sleeping giant, but I looked up the one you were mentioning, and it looks like a giant on its back. In my hometown, Ojai, California, there's a peak called Chief's Peak that looks very much like an Indian chief that's lying on its back. So I used to hike that mountain and got up close many times, and I always thought, oh, it does look like a being, but it never occurred to me that it might be. This is what I think is most interesting when you have things like eye sockets. This is something that could be explored. I've never seen anyone go in and get any footage inside these caves, because if that's an eye socket, there should be something inside that is reminiscent of an eye socket as well.
Well, and that was a question I wanted to ask you when we were talking about the elephant. If the entire being is petrified, then only certain aspects of it would be hollow, because even though we are essentially we have hollow cavities in our body, but even like all of our organs and whatnot, if those petrify, we wouldn't be just like an empty vessel. There'd still be like, whatever remnants of our organs just petrified.
Right. Yeah. So then you want to go into those things, which is what I've done in the second video and the fifth video. I spelunked in the eye socket. I'd love to get up to the ear, but it's off limits. You have to have permission to get up there and ropes and everything.
Right.
But the eye socket is interesting because you have the main shape of the socket itself, and then there's those channels going down at an angle that lead into the sinuses, which are kind of behind this bone in us. And there's a deeper cave, and I've gone in and shimmied down this pretty narrow passage that it's kind of creepy, and then it opens up into a cavern deeper inside. So you can see that in the fifth Unveiling a Titan video. So I was always skeptical of these claims that people were making, and these are just a list of some of the main reasons. We talked about pareidolia, shadows, foliage. Now you have the whole problem with AI, which is just polluting the whole research community because so few people have discernment and can recognize it, and soon it'll be so sophisticated that even people with discernment can't tell the difference. So that's a worrying thing. So that's where the on-site investigations become more and more important, because if someone is there in person and they're filming in HD and they're moving around and they're showing you stuff, that's a lot different from looking at something on Google Earth, and Google Earth can be manipulated as well, as I've shown. So yeah, and then going deeper with it, looking at how it lines up anatomically, the tissues, is it matching up? One of the problems I've had also is that people are looking at, if you think of our face, we have skin, we have eyes, we have the cartilage of the nose, we have bone. Those are all different tissues, and in my mind, they shouldn't all petrify to the exact same material. There should be different kinds of materials if it's truly petrified. So you see these creatures, it looks like a being laying on its back, and the nose is sticking up. Well, why would the nose be the exact same material as the rest of the head? It doesn't make sense to me. So I tend to be, people send me all kinds of stuff, and I tend to be very skeptical of a lot of it. So these are the typical pitfalls. Apophenia is the same as pareidolia, but this is just recognizing a pattern that doesn't exist. And did you see any of the stuff on the heartstones? Did you come across that at all when you're looking at the stuff on my channel?
No, not enough to have anything to say about it, but I'm curious. Are these petrified hearts, basically?
Yeah, it started with I was just, after I got into this subject with the mountain, and I started looking at geology and just asking the question, like, what is stone really? Like, we're told that things like this, sedimentary layers, are formed over these incredibly long periods of time. You got your Big Bang leading to the formation of the planets, and all of these different eras: Jurassic, Cretaceous, Mesozoic, all these different things, and the great dyings off that have occurred. This is mainstream geology right up to this. But they don't tell us that rock layers can form in a matter of hours. This structure here formed in just a few hours when Mount St. Helens erupted, and it has all this microlayering that's indicative of these different layers of strata. And then, even if you believe the mainstream, cycle of petrogenesis, which is this, which we've talked about already, that seems pretty simplistic for something like this. How do you explain this when this looks so biological? You have all these, I'll show a little video clip of this in a moment, but you have these structures that have concentric rings. You have all of this incredible complexity of swirling grain that looks exactly like a tree or plant life or some kind of a biological material. And, with something like this, we're looking at, so if you believe the mainstream narrative of sedimentary layers and then tectonic activity breaking things upward, and then breaking off into smaller and smaller pieces, you've got these kinds of things to explain. This incredible detail of grain on this stone here, that's stretching and going across into this structure, which also seems to have almost like a cell-like structure. I struggle to see how the cycle of petrogenesis can explain that, or this.
Wow.
This is called white pocket. And when I see this, I don't know what it is. I'm not making any assertions, but to me, this is biogeology. Whether it was some form of plant life or it was a creature, it looks more like creature to me. It's got a very fleshy, kind of cellular look. Petrification, indisputed fact. We've got lots of examples of it. The question is, how long does it take? I mentioned petrified wood, that they can do it in a laboratory. I'm going to breeze through these. People can pause if they want to read this and they want to look up the studies themselves. But, 1400 degrees Celsius for 2 hours with some argon gas after soaking them in an acid bath. And they're able to petrify wood that's indistinguishable from naturally occurring petrified wood in 24 hours. It's just,
Wow.
So this is the kind of stuff that people need to be doing when they're looking at this. It's not enough to just look at pictures on Instagram and then share them. So things I discovered along the way that I didn't know is that stuff like opal is petrified wood. It's coming from trees. So is obsidian. A lot of the metals. Ben has, Waking Up with Analog, has sent me articles showing, here they are, looking at that they were harvesting all kinds of petrified forests, that the trees had silver and gold and copper in them in really large amounts. And I think that this is a result of transmutation of elements. I don't think that the trees were growing metals. If they were, things look very different in the past. But I've basically come to the mind after looking into all of this stuff that anything can petrify. And we're taught that soft tissue can't, because it would be consumed by bacteria and larvae long before any potential petrification would occur. But we've got lots of examples of petrified trees. And then, like I said, I think anything can petrify. These are petrified brains. Our bodies are making stones. So a lot of the pebbles on the beaches could, things that we call geodes, they could be petrified stones that were made inside of bodies. They could be petrified fruit. Anything can petrify. And in a variety of ways, which I'll touch on. But maybe I should give you the mic for a little bit if you have any questions, or
No, I'm
if you want me to just
fascinated. Keep
rolling.
going for a while, because I am writing notes. Yeah.
So these are kidney stones and gallstones. These are drawings of them. This is agate, and these are kidney stones. And if you look at cross sections of them, they look identical to geodes. So I think that tree sap petrifies to varying types of quartz. I'll show some examples of that in a moment. Any kind of fruit, any kind of seed, nut, even fungus, all of this is potential material for petrification. A lot of people wonder about these, what are they called? I've forgotten the name, right? A lot of people theorize about these, and I just ask the question, is it possible that maybe this was also something that originally came from a tree? Like, imagine if this was very, very, very large and it laid down, and then all of these berries that are growing on the stalk of the tree were to petrify. They might look a lot like that. Mungo Jupp of the Thunderbolts Project, he put together a video called Instant Fossilization, and he's showing all kinds of examples in the fossil record of things that should not be petrified, are petrified in great detail. These are jellyfish. Here's a fish eating another fish. And so it begs the question, how fast can things petrify? I don't think this was 200 million years old. This is a very interesting video. Check this out.
Caves that they say are millions of years old, this right here took 6 months to form.
These are the inside of
Question.
pipes.
Here's a dinosaur vertebrae. If these right here can form in that length of time, anywhere between weeks to months to years, how long does it take to fossilize a dinosaur bone? If the
Or a dragon
creationists are
bone.
right, then it's 4,500 years, no older. What do you think? I'm about to show you 5 different examples of rock forming quickly. Then I'm going to ask you a question about a dinosaur bone I'm going to show at the end. From Karlovy Vary in the Czech Republic, mineralized water went through these pipes and formed this in 80 years. Here's a spark plug in stone, no more than 20 to 40 years to form this. This little guy right here was put into a mineral springs in Karlovy Vary, and
I'll show
within
some
just
more
6
examples of
weeks,
that.
it turned to stone. And this right here, this is the same material you find in stalactites and stalagmites in those caves that they say are millions of years old. This right here took 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah. So, clearly things that they're telling us about how long things take to happen are inaccurate. So paramineralization is what I talked about before, which is this exchange of materials. High mineral content waters, I'll show some visual examples in a moment. Mother Shipton's cave in England. Lightning plasma does it. Volcanic ash, especially when mixed with mineral-rich water, will petrify. Then it gets into theories about transmutation of elements, that the body can create elements and that trees can create elements. And we're told that elements can only form in the heart of stars in the heliocentric model, but there's a lot of examples of that just being false as well. I talked about artificial diamonds and rubies, and this is an example of high mineral content waters petrifying. This is a lake called Lake Natron. These creatures fall in and then they start to be encased in material, and it eventually will harden all the way through. Talked about plasma Lichtenberg figures earlier. This is what happens when you hit wood with high electricity. And where would you find high electricity? Volcanic activity.
Wow.
And this is the Lichtenberg figures that we were talking about before. This is definitely created by electricity, not by water erosion.
Wow. Yeah, it
And
reminds
then
me of
this is-
dendritic agate, which is a crystal, stone type of agate, which has all these little, basically this Lichten. Is it? I keep wanting to say Lichtenstein.
Lichtenberg figure.
Lichtenberg.
Yeah.
Yeah, dendritic agate, which I'm sure you have a more accurate reason why this is the way it is. Maybe these are actually crystallized plants of some kind.
Yeah, that would be my guess.
Yeah.
Looking at it, definitely. I think biogeology as a placeholder term is very helpful, because it gives a starting point. You don't have to be an expert in geology. To be an expert in geology is to know zillions of different Latin terms and a whole bunch of chemical processes that supposedly did this, that, or the other. And it's always things that you can't reproduce and you can't verify for yourself.
Right.
And so we talked to, you've got the supernatural petrification. I'm just going to breeze through these. Each one of these slides is a presentation in itself, but examples of man-made petrification. And then you have.
Now it said they're growing opals. Opals come from wood. What is the process
so
there?
you can grow opal. There's videos on how to do it on YouTube, but opals also are found in their natural locations. I've got a video under the live stream tab that's specifically about geodes and opals and stuff like that. And there's video clips of guys going in and harvesting the opals, and everything around where they're finding the opal seams is also looking like petrified tree.
Could it be like opal is maybe the petrified sap from the tree?
Yeah, and it depends on trace elements. So I think what's happening, my theory when it comes to this, going back to this here, is the electricity is causing the elements in the wood to align themselves. Oh, there we go. To align themselves along the lines of current. So if you think of the Lichtenberg figure, this fractal pattern, they're gonna go looking in these areas for different kinds of elements, and some are going to be rare and some are going to be abundant. Quartz is the most abundant mineral in the world, so you're going to find that in, you know, huge amounts. Let me show you some of the best evidence for the big trees, just so people can get a taste of this. So, well, actually, before I do that, here's just a little crash course in wood. This is how wood breaks down. Keep these little blocks in mind. Like one of these little chunks, a little chunk like this one. And the grain and the way the swirls go, some of it's charred because it's burned, others fresh and it's got color, and it's got incredible complexity always. And this will break down and become the forest floor. Well, if this were to petrify to sandstone, eventually that would break down to sand. And then we cook that and turn it into glass. So this is from the work of a man named Mike Alley. Hangman1128 is his channel. You can see here when the oxidized part is removed that it's still got grain underneath. But what you're seeing here is identical to what he was holding in his hand. This is much better in HD. I don't know what we're broadcasting at right now, but for high quality footage, you can go to my channel or to his. I got the chance to tour the Black Hills of South Dakota and the Garden of the Gods with him in July. And he showed me some of these incredible sights firsthand. If you go onto my channel and go back about 10 videos down, I have a whole bunch of 2-minute video clips of touring these sites up close and personal. But you can see here that this is exhibiting tree grain and sap and in every way, shape, and form, from the micro to the macro. But even this little piece right here is far, far bigger than we're told any petrified tree has ever been.
Right.
And that's just a tiny little chunk.
Wow.
As Mike says, it's just a grain of sand in a sea of tree. But let me just show you.
Kind of feels
so
like
many,
what we're realizing is that the landscape we see now is almost like a dying version of its former self. Like at least this, if you want to attribute scale to health and wellness, it almost seems like our Earth has been like shrinking.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've been on board with the holographic universe idea for about 30 years. I read Talbot's book on that subject and thought it was compelling. And then the idea that things are fractal. I mean, we can look at things with a microscope. We can look with the naked eye. We can look on Google Earth, and there's this repetition of patterns. So I don't see any reason why if we're this big and there used to be giants, why couldn't there have once been titans? And then someone like Roger Spur from Mudfossil University, he's regularly talking about 1,000-mile-long dragons and that sort of thing. So, you know, maybe there were continental-size creatures as well. And you know, what is this place? How big is it? How deep down do things go? There's a lot of things that we're told, you know, the cross section of the Earth with the Earth's mantle and the molten iron core that's supposedly spinning and giving us our electromagnetic field. Is there any truth to that? How do they know? The deepest they've ever dug is 12 kilometers deep, and it took them 20 years to get that far down. So it's, to me, this photograph says it all. This is petrified sap. If they want to find gold, silver, copper, precious materials, they're looking in quartz veins or quartz seams. And then what do they find? They find gold and silver veins. They're even using anatomical terminology when they're describing this stuff. And so there's so many data points that line up with this. Like, for example, the salt mines, if you look at them, they look exactly like tree grain as well. So I think that there are different ways in which things can petrify. These are salt mountains here and here, and these are marble caves in Patagonia. And you can see the incredible complexity of grain and color. Explain to me how this happens through sedimentary layering. It doesn't make any sense, you know.
Right. Well, and it would,
especially when you see this kind of incredible beauty. This looks far more like something that grew. You like this structure. How does that happen with sedimentary layering? They can come up with all kinds of different explanations that are, long-winded and far-fetched, but they can't reproduce any of them. They're just making claims about stuff, and then they have their dating techniques. But these are the salt mines in Romania and in Poland, and to me, it just screams tree in every way.
Wow.
And then going back to this is what wood grain looks like, and it's exactly what we were just seeing. And then this is very similar to wood grain, but that's on a coastline. But this, look at this. If people can't see that this was clearly once tree, I can't help them. This is what I consider to be self-evident proof of the former existence of the great trees, because everything about this says wood.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like that would make more sense in a way, that our world would generate itself in this way, that rocks would be the result of plant life in a more direct way. Yeah, this is incredible.
Biogeology.
Yeah.
So if you think about these layers here, if you buy the mainstream model, we have to believe that the Earth did this for a while, and then it did this, and then it went back for a short time to the other thing. And if you look at the way tree grain grows, this is what it does. But sedimentary layering, why would it just keep alternating back and forth between these completely different things? These are completely different materials, different colors, made out of different substances. And then how does that swirling happen without all kinds of cracking and breaking of the layers? Oh, it had to be soft and molten, and then it was flowing, and then it cooled rapidly, or maybe it just grew. So this, to me, is some of the best proof of the former trees. This is Petra in Jordan, and I don't remember where these are located, but this is what I was talking about before. I think that these were carved into while it was still wood. That's my belief.
Right.
And I've got some compelling
And living wood, too.
evidence for
It's
that.
not that they had huge...
Or while still living, yeah. But if the grain is going horizontal like this, and then these are upright and they're not like at an angle or something, then I think it's more likely that part of a tree or the tree fell, and then they carved into it as it lay.
Right.
And then when you see this,
But
is
the carving
inside
would have happened before petrification.
right, and then
Right.
your tools wouldn't have had to be nearly as hard or
Right.
sophisticated.
Yeah.
And again, everything about this screams tree to me, and you can see that they've carved in, but this grain and this layering is prevalent everywhere, and yeah. So I think this gets back to hiding resources. The gold and the silver is there. I've made a video called "There's Gold in Them There Trees." And if you look at the different quartz seams, let's see. Second cycle. There we go. That was slow. So this is what they're looking for when they're going to try and find gold. So I think that my theory is that the gold and the silver are originally monatomics that are in the trees, in their sap, like part of their blood flow. And then when the plasma event happens, or electricity, then that is going along those fractal lines, and that's why it's found in veins, and that it's the monatomics are accumulating along the fractal pattern.
Wow.
It's my theory.
Yeah. Wow, this is incredible stuff.
They think that amber is petrified sap,
Right.
but I don't think so, because it's a 2.5 on the hardness scale. Diamond is a 10, and sometimes I get the scale reversed, but diamond hardest, and at the other end of the scale, it's soft enough to dent with your fingernail. But if this were to petrify, then I would expect it to be something more like quartz. And sap comes in any color. You can find green sap, you can find like red, as you see here.
Right.
And then I showed those pictures already.
Now, could it be that amber is sap, but just hardened through maybe oxidation rather than this electromagnetic process?
Exactly. So, well, also it could probably, with high mineral content waters, maybe electricity, it could, without some major plasma event on a smaller scale, it could probably turn to stone. Oxidization makes it harder. I've got photographs of tree stumps that after the tree has been cut down, the sap has leaked out and then oxidized, and it looks identical to amber at that point.
Right,
but
right.
Is it petrified? Probably not.
No.
I've done a live stream called Spelunking Titanic Trees, and I didn't know about this, but this is footage from guys known as the Action Adventure Twins. So there are a lot of examples of these trees that have water coming out of them. So they're tapping into some deeper water source, and then it's just like a waterfall coming out of the tree. And so if you had a tree that was this size, then those root structures are going to reach down into the earth and probably tap into primary water. And so I didn't know it, but there's guys that are going down 500 to 1,000 foot caves that look like this. And then I'll show some footage. But this is an example of a tree gushing like a fire hydrant.
Could you imagine walking through the woods and you just stumble upon this? I mean, that's crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
For the listening
So
audience,
for
it
that much
literally
water
looks
to
like
come
a fire
through,
hose is coming through a tree right now. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So what would the channels look like in order for that to happen? Well, this guy's going into a root, and you're going to see him climb in. And just pay note to what the inside of this looks like when it comes to the grain.
Wow. Now, is this
Pretty cool, huh?
is this species of tree specifically hollow like this, or is this something that most trees happens to?
I don't know
most
anything
trees?
about this. I just saw this
Yeah.
video on Instagram, and I was like, wow,
Yeah,
that's
no,
cool.
I've seen it too, but I get your point about the grain and the similarity between cave structures. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so this is the Action Adventure Twins, and I think the mainstream model would want us to believe that this is formed through some kind of massive water erosion when the Earth was younger, right? But if you look at the sides, there's no smoothness to them. There's all these broken chunks, and it doesn't look at all like something that formed through water erosion. But if you look at the way tree grain grows, you have horizontal lines in the tree and vertical lines, vertical and horizontal both. And that's why when it's decomposing, it breaks down into those little chunks that I was showing before.
Yeah.
And then, looking at cave structures, which we know if you look into the real history of the realm, which is being unveiled so thoroughly now by so many different channels, things are a lot different than we were taught. And underground, everything seems to exist everywhere and in multiple layers. Again, Ben is doing some of the best work on that subject.
Wow. Wow, this is
I'm just
incredible.
really briefly hitting on a bunch of these different data
Right.
points, because if people might have been exposed to the great tree idea, and then all they see are the stumps, and they think that's all the data out there that,
I'm guilty of
suggest.
that. I initially dismissed the whole notion based on that premise alone, and then when I dug deeper and saw the examples of this on your channel, which you've shown just a small selection of here, it's like, yeah, I'm much more in a place to believe this than the mainstream geology, their opinion.
Well, the thing that's also so compelling about it is, as you get into this stuff, what you find is everything starts to dovetail. Everything starts to work very beautifully with
Right.
with
This
the
is a
ideas.
concept we
it's
talk
not
about.
like a far-fetched
Right. There's a
kind of idea.
congruency. There's a congruency and a symbiosis to these sciences, and we should expect that if that's what we notice happening in nature with living organisms. They symbiotically fit together, right? Oh my gosh, these guys are nuts! Bicycles
Yeah.
in a
But
in
you
a
see how the
cave
tunnels
system.
are bifurcating there?
Yeah, well, and it's also incredible just how, what would you call it, curved, I guess, for lack of a better term. Like it just, to me, when I think of rock, I don't think of these like natural curves like this. I don't, this seems much more fluid, like the way wood and plants grow, like in this, what would you call a plant structure where it's ultimately always curved in some way. Like there's a name for that, I'm sure.
Yeah, these are, what you're seeing now is lava tubes, right? And a lot of these lava tubes, when you look at the walls more closely, you realize it looks just like tree grain.
Yeah.
And if this was formed by lava, how does that happen? The lava just pushes through this hard rock and then forms this and then disappears. It's an interesting one. So I talked about the channels going in. So this would explain nicely these tepuis that exist around the world, which are these plateau structures that look a lot like tree stumps, and they have these never-ending waterfalls. That's clearly not coming from rainfall here, right? So this structure is somehow tapped into the waters of the deep, and interestingly enough, they're called artesian wells. So if you think of an artery, again, they're using terminology we're familiar with.
Interesting. I would have suspected that went to the term artisan, but no, that makes a lot more sense when you put it that way. Wow. Yeah, and the other thing I know about these tepuis is that they have, what do you call it, like a micro climate, or not a climate, but the Jesus, I'm losing my mind over here. But the
like
ecosystem,
microclimate.
the ecosystem, the animals that exist on the top of these are different than the surrounding areas, which would make you think that they were isolated from the rest of the environment at some point in history and left up there, right? So maybe this would have been that cataclysm point where certain species stayed up there and the rest of them dispersed.
Yeah, little pockets of survival.
Right.
So here's another really interesting subject that I got into on my channel, really by accident. So this is just looking at different hearts, and you can see here this one is covered in a fatty layer, as is this one. This one has less fat, and you can see some of the flesh through it. Here's red. And most of the heart is not heart muscle as we think, but is actually a fascial matrix. And there's a video, and you can see this, where she's
a whole functional organ, but the field has struggled with the ability to make sure that once you get cells into whatever scaffold or matrix you're using, that then there's a problem with getting all the media, the nutrients, all the things that the cells need to stay alive. And so the beauty of perfusion decellularization is we start with all that architecture intact, and more importantly, that all the blood vessels, all the vasculature system is still intact. So when we introduce cells back into that organ,
watch this.
They will already have a natural supply and be able to be fed with, oxygen and nutrients, and we don't have to worry about trying to establish that vasculature system. So we've definitely.
So she introduced blood into the heart there, and it went from this ghostly white to this color in a matter of seconds.
Right.
So it's just showing that most of the heart is this kind of fatty matrix. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I came across this stone. I was walking in a river bottom and picked it up, and I immediately recognized that it had a bunch of anatomical features that lined up with heart anatomy. And I had studied the heart in chiropractic college quite a bit, and after looking at this for about 2 or 3 minutes in the river bottom, I was like, this is crazy. I've got to take this home and analyze it. This is about 4 times the size of a human heart, so it would be something like a cow or a horse or something like that, possibly something bigger. But this is showing, this stone has chambers in it. This would be the aorta and the vena cava, the 2 biggest blood vessels in the body. You can see the isthmus here, which is the pulmonary artery, and this is what it looks like when it's fresh. And that's right here in the stone. And then so basically, after pulling out the anatomy books and examining this more thoroughly, there were 15 different anatomical features that lined up perfectly with the heart in one stone. And hearts take a lot of different shapes. This is elephant, this is giraffe, long and narrow, just kind of like the creature. I think human and pig are very similar. And so I made a video about it. Originally, I thought these were mud fossils. It didn't make sense to me how the heart could be found outside the body if it was a mud fossil, and I later abandoned that as a theory. But this was what I was able to document with that one stone alone. I went in with endoscopic cameras. I've looked at it with microscopy. I've analyzed it from the inside to the outside. I had them CAT scanned. And also,
So this is differing from the mud fossil theory in the sense that it's not that the mineralization or the petrification comes from some sort of medium outside that the organ is submerged in. It's just the biological nature of things to petrify under these circumstances, that then the heart becomes separated afterwards as the stone degrades.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, you nailed it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I was puzzled. I couldn't explain why I was finding this. I figured if this is true, then it should be repeatable. Going back to that scientific method slide I just showed a moment ago, that there should be others. So I went out looking for them, and I started to find them in droves. And it took me a little while, but I eventually recognized that the easiest to spot and the most common pattern is this one you're seeing right here. It's like a harp-shaped form.
Right.
It'll often be white on the outside, but I've had subscribers that have sent me photographs of the ones they've found. People are finding these all over the world now that I've been making videos and showing this pattern. But it tapers in on one side, and it takes on this harp shape, because when the body dies, we go into rigor mortis, where all the muscles contract in the body, and so the heart contracts and it tapers in, and it spirals at the bottom. And so I started to look for these things, and I was finding them in droves. Really, it's been a wild ride. So I had them CAT scanned, some of the best ones I had, showing the internal chambers. I went in with endoscopy.
Wow.
Sliced them open.
Now, is there something about the heart that would maybe, as the entire body petrifies, maybe the heart would be left intact more so than other organs?
Yeah. So I had different theories early on. You don't throw out empirical evidence for something just because you can't explain the why of it.
Right.
And so I knew they couldn't be mud fossils, because if the body were to be encased in mud and then to petrify over long periods of time, you wouldn't find a bunch of organs separate from the bodies. So some people were asking me, was this some kind of a satanic ritual where they were removing the hearts from the bodies and petrifying them? And the answer is no, because I'm finding them. It's totally scalable. I've got them from like millimeters up to, the biggest one in my office is, I don't know, a third of a meter or so, and foot and a half long. That's this one here, also exhibiting those blood vessel openings, and the backside has got the aorta right exactly where it should be. And so here, let me just show you this. So the cardinal features are this harp shape. At the top, you'll have the openings for the blood vessels, and then there are these lines that go through them, and several of these stones have these lines in the exact place that they should be, and those lines, I'll show you why they form in a moment. But this is incredibly specific to heart anatomy. It's very repeatable. I've shown these to geologists and to scientists, and they're baffled. They haven't seen this. It's not documented in the geological narrative. They just call these heart-shaped stones, and they say that they're conglomerate cobbles that have formed as clay has compressed in sedimentary layering. And then later on, because of tectonic activity and the breaking up of those sedimentary layers, has popped out and rolled around in a river bottom and smoothed out. This one you can see is broken, and inside it's very fleshy. When you get them wet, they exhibit a lot more color. And then again, look at this last one I'm going to pick up. It's showing the blood vessels right at the top where it should be, and you can see how white it is. And everywhere the white has worn away, it's red inside. And that one I sliced, and it's got a blood vessel going right through the middle of it. So this is incredibly specific. It's very repeatable and predictable and scalable. And so getting back to your question, the only thing I could make sense of was that somehow the outer portions of the body have to be destroyed while the rest of the body is petrifying, or while the organs are petrifying. So I call it boiled egg theory, and the idea being that eggs are soft and liquidy until you boil them for 9, 10, 12 minutes, and then they harden. And so what would happen if they hardened way more? You know, a lot more heat, a lot more time. It's possible that they might start to turn to stone.
Right.
And then what happens to the muscle and to the bone? Well, if you cook them in a crock pot, they turn to mush and eventually turn to bone broth.
Right.
So it's yeah, you were going to ask something, or
Well, I'm curious because we've talked about quartz, and just from what I know about minerals and whatnot, I know that a mineral can have a crystal form, but then, you know, other forms beyond that. So when we think of a quartz crystal, we often think of maybe like a quartz point, right? Like something like this.
Yeah, so you can grow crystals. There's lots of videos, and I've shown a video on my channel where they're growing what looks like a quartz crystal that's like this big in like 40 to 60 days. And so you put it in the right kind of a solution, it uses that solution as fuel, and it just continues to grow. So when you see geodes, like if you imagine a petrified coconut, Ben has found multiple newspaper articles of varying petrified fruits from this time period before. And what happens is you have the fruit, but then it's using the fuel of the fruit to grow crystal. And we can see this happening, you know, in real time with just like that crystallization of sugar that happens, like honey and whatnot. So you can imagine it consuming whatever was the original material, and then you get these pointed amethyst-like geode structures.
Right. Almost like a hollow.
So that's different from what I showed before when I was showing the tree examples, where you have these quartz seams, and that's not these pointy, jagged kind of crystals. Right. That's the same. It's like a hardened amorphous material.
Right.
And so that's far more like petrified sap, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I just wanted to point that out. What I know about crystals isn't much, but I just figured I'd clarify because I got confused in my own head there for a second. Also, you can see this, but my audience can't see this, but I have this stone that I was, thank you. Yeah, I have this stone that I was gifted, and I don't know, maybe you'd have to hold it in your own hands to make a good assessment, but I've found these stones in stores before. They're usually marketed as like holy stones is what they're called, but what do you make of this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my first thought is it looks a lot like trabecular bone, so it could be limestone, and but it could also be something that has eroded through saltwater erosion. So some things they get this pockmarked holy look to them because they've gone through like a mineral erosion. So it's hard. I'd need a lot more to go on. I get people sending me stuff all the time, and a lot of people who've watched my videos, they think now I'm starting to see it, and then they start making videos, and they're showing stuff that is very, very non-specific, and they're making claims. This is a turtle head, and this is a this, and this is
right.
And it's possible that they could be right, but they start to see it in everything. So you really got to be cautious. I've got the left brain analytical Virgo mindset going, and then I also like the abstract as well, and I can see things from an artistic perspective. So I think I try and strike a balance between the two. But,
Yeah. Well, and it's
some people-
important to note all the ways that this can be misconstrued, because it helps us be more exact about where we actually do have examples of biogeology. So no, I appreciate that. And so we just paused on a slide. If you want to continue back to that slide.
I want to show your audience this. Many people have never heard this or know about this. This was discovered in 1972 by a Spanish cardiologist, and this became really important for the work that I was doing because I'd already been gathering heart stones and making videos about them before I came across this. Someone made a comment on my channel, and then eventually I looked up the name of the doctor and saw a documentary about his life, and it just blew my mind for a variety of reasons. One, I came to understand that what I thought I knew about the heart and what I'd been taught in school was completely wrong, and it's far more amazing. So just check this out.
Did you know that almost everything you were taught about the heart is wrong? Most everyone today, even doctors, still believe the heart to be a 4-chamber pump that pushes blood through a mind-boggling 60,000 miles of narrowing blood vessels to fuel our 40 trillion cells, then filling again as if by magic on relaxation. Well, that theory was thoroughly debunked by the Spanish cardiologist Francisco Torrent Guasp back in 1972. After dissecting thousands of hearts, Guasp finally discovered the heart's true structure. The heart's far more amazing than we ever knew. It's like a rope, a long tube wrapped in...
Let me just pause it there real quick. So he just literally unraveled the heart. And when the technique that he developed was he boiled hearts, and then he removed the outer fatty white layer with, like, very carefully with a scalpel. Once he did that, he's able to bluntly dissect the heart by just literally pulling on the threads, and it opens up and it unravels, and you can see it fully unraveled here. This is what it looks like from the bottom, this spiral. And he already theorized at this point that blood was not being pushed. That was how he got on this topic in the first place. The mainstream model of the circulatory system made no sense to him. And from a plumbing perspective, that it's pushing the blood, and the blood vessels are getting narrower and narrower, and blood is highly viscous, so it's slow to move. And it didn't make any sense that it's going out to all of our cells like that. So he spent, I think, 20 years dissecting hearts before he finally discovered this.
to a knot. Instead of being pushed, the blood is pulled through the heart.
And so when I saw this documentary about his life and I saw him roll the heart back up, I saw this line here and this line here, and then the other line on the front side. And I realized that a bunch of the stones that I had already gathered had those lines. And so I ran to the collection, and sure enough, not only did they have the lines, but they were in the right places, curving in the right direction. And then the other thing is this vortexual flow to the heart, this spiral that's happening is, where's the laser pointer? I can't find it now. But so the spiral flow is also when the heart contracts, it contracts in a spiral, and you can see that at the bottom.
Vortexes. This has been proven with CAT scans, functional MRI, and positronic emission. Look at the spiraling contraction. It changes everything we know about the heart and circulation. If you'd like to know more, check out these videos.
So I made an initial video called Helical Hearts, Petrified Organs, and Synchronicities, just talking about the correlation between his work, the work of Victor Schauberger, the water genius, and also talking about Rudolf Steiner's ideas a little bit about the heart. And there's just loads of synchronicities that have happened. And one of the biggest synchronicities is this mountain that I live on. Let me just go back to the laser pointer. So right here, this is Montgo. This doctor, Francisco Torrent Guasp, lived and worked his entire career out of his family practice, out of his home, on this mountain.
Wow.
It's totally mind-blowing.
Yeah, it all connects back together. Wow.
Yeah, and so I ended up meeting his son. His son came to my office, and I showed him a bunch of these stones. I think he was mostly puzzled by the whole thing, but so that's this was huge for me because I had already been gathering these stones, and when I saw this and I realized that it has this spiral at the bottom, I went back and a lot of these stones have this twist at the bottom. And let's see, stop sharing here for a second. Let's see, this is one of the ones. So the blood vessel at the top, the tapering in on the side. Usually one side will be thinner, like a knife edge, because one ventricle has a thinner wall than the other. And then at the bottom, it'll have that twist like a propeller blade.
Wow.
And it's very specific, and especially when you add the sulcus lines, you can see it right there, exactly where it should be on the front, curving in the right direction, and then there on the back.
Right.
And it's incredibly repeatable. There's that knife edge that I was talking about, thick on that side, and you don't always see the blood vessel openings, but sometimes there'll be indentations or creases at the top, and then again that twist at the bottom. And I got hundreds and hundreds of examples of this phenomenon. The backside will curve inward or just be flat, and then the top will tend to be faceted.
Well,
and you can see that twist, and I could show these rocks for the next 2 hours, just showing example after example. But
well, just to remind me, in case I forgot, and you already did answer this, but why exactly is it that the heart, do you think, is preserved? And I not that I'm questioning it, I actually think it's incredibly profound, to think that, and especially if this is something that happens regularly and not just in extreme events where, there's a great plasma event, but I don't know, it doesn't seem all that out of place considering we already use things like tombstones and all these, stones in the process of, celebrating or remembering the dead.
let me show you real quick something that will make it clearer. So these are examples of heartstones that have been sent to me by other people, and in other parts of the world it can be far more fleshy. Here in Spain where I am, it's the ones I find tend to most often be white, a little bit of pink. Some of them I broken open. I have one video called Broken Hearts Tell Tales, and you can see when I break them open, it looks like blood on the inside in chambers. But what I wanted to show you was going back to, have you ever heard of bog bodies?
Yeah. Yes, I have.
Okay. So bog bodies are an interesting phenomenon. This is what they look like. If they fall into peat bogs, if the body, like if you, in Lord of the Rings, towards the end, I think in the third movie, on his way to Mordor, Frodo is crossing this swamp and he looks down and there are all these dead soldiers and they're just in this bog and they're perfectly preserved. Well, the interesting thing over long periods of time is that the bones and the muscles dissolve while the organs harden and the skin is preserved. So basically what you're left with is a fatty sac filled with hardened organs. So if that were to happen on a widespread basis, that could explain why there would be a lot of petrified organs found around the world.
Now,
and
why is it that the softer things harden and the hardest things dissolve? Is there an explanation for that?
I think it's the acid in the peat bog that's doing it. And I think, so this gets back to your question, which is related to what I call boiled egg theory, is that the outer body is somehow being destroyed. And if you think of volcanic activity as an example, a pyroclastic flow can reach temperatures of 1500 degrees Celsius and move at the speed of sound. Those are mainstream numbers. And that would be pretty intense for a body. So what would happen? We have a chest and abdominal cavity that are protecting our organs, right here and here, and that cavity is a thick fatty sac filled with fluid, and then the organs are anchored inside in that, and they're suspended in that fluid. And so if the outer portion of the body is being hit by either electricity or plasma or volcanic heat and was being just burned alive and destroyed, then the inside would be like a pressure cooker. Like if you put things in a pressure cooker, they cook really fast, and you need less heat and less time. So if you have a pressure cooker and you crank up the heat, what's going to happen? Well, this will boil and boil and boil. So that's why I called it hard, boiled egg theory, is that the organs would be hardening, and they might not harden all the way to stone. They might just harden enough to be preserved once the rest of the body has been destroyed. There's evidence of that. One of my subs sent me a really nice letter. He was talking about his dog that passed away, and it was so dear to him that he wanted to honor it with a proper funeral. And so he created a pyre that was like 6 foot wide and 8 foot long of like the hottest burning wood you can imagine. And this thing burnt for like somewhere between 24 and 36 hours straight with really high temperatures. And when all was said and done, everything was turned to ash, and he could distinguish between the ash from the body and the ash from the wood. And so he poured some water on just to make sure that the fire was out. And what had preserved, the only thing that was preserved out of the entire dog's body was the heart. And it was firm. So that suggests that the heart is hardy. And it's also surrounded in the pericardium, which is this fatty sac that I showed you before. And unlike an egg, which has a hard shell, which will crack if you cook it too long or too fast, the pericardium is flexible and could expand. So as you have the contraction of the heart muscle, and then it's being hit with all this heat, it's the perfect conditions to preserve the heart to at least to a point where it would survive the remainder of the destruction of the body. And then maybe those organs are buried in mud or whatever, and that finishes off the process.
Wow.
So that's my theory about it.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I was going to wrap it up, but you just reminded me of another question that comes to mind when you mentioned the process of burning. We had a guest on the show named Marcel Foti, and he's been talking a lot about the natron theory, which we mentioned Natron Lake. So I'm going to guess you're probably familiar with the natron theory to some extent. But one of the things that he talked to us about was how the 4 elements, the classical 4 elements, can be used to create stone, and the process through which this takes place. And I've talked to a friend of mine who's a stonemason. He works with tiles and masonry, and he's like, no, that's impossible, right? So there's one perspective. Now, the other perspective says that if you have the right materials and the right circumstances, you can burn wood using, fire and then water and then air and, of course, earth. You can create a stone, and that's how he theorizes these big, tall menhirs were created. The big standing stones that we see in parts of the world is that they would just progressively burn a fire and throw the right ingredients on it until it was so tall they couldn't continue the process.
Mm. Have you interviewed Topher Gardner on your channel?
Oh yeah, Topher and I have done a ton of shows together. Yeah,
he and I have done a couple together as well. And he went to the Geopolymer Institute in France. And so he knows geopolymers, and he's on board with all of these theories as far as instant petrification and gigantism, and we just had a really interesting conversation on my channel, on his podcast, and I just posted it on my channel last week. But one of the things that he told me was that natron is one of the key ingredients in geopolymers. So you have these certain building blocks that are needed to create artificial stone, and one of those is natron. So isn't that interesting? You've got a lake with high contents of natron, and creatures fall in and they turn to stone. And then
Right.
then you got I'll share a picture here of Mother Shipton's cave. That's an interesting phenomenon as well. Let me see if I can find it quickly here.
Well, and how fascinating would it be if most of the sculptures that we see in the classical world and now museums and whatnot were actual living beings that were just petrified through this very sophisticated process that would have turned them into maybe like marble or something very high, you know,
Yeah,
high quality.
I think that's a definite possibility. I think they could also be different kinds of
We even talk
geopolymer, as
about-
I was suggesting before.
We even talk
they-
about the marbling of flesh. When you look at the cows, you know, they're cutting up a cow. You know, my cousin was a butcher, and you talk about marbling of flesh. What, you know, all these similar names. It's very, very uncanny. From artesian,
Isn't
artery,
it, though?
veins. Yeah, I mean, it's over and
Yeah.
over again.
These are the works of Girolamo Sagato.
Wow.
So this is all petrified stuff that can be seen in museums in
Right.
Italy.
Right.
And then here's some examples of opalized wood. And this is obviously a small scale, but if the trees were gigantic, then you're going to have opal seams, not just like, you know, encasing the outer portion of a tree. So I think this is what's happening. This birefringence of the opal is what's happening when silica is introduced into the biological material. I don't necessarily think that the tree looked like this when it was growing. I think that's something that probably happened after the fact. And then this stuff here, I don't know if this is flesh, but it sure looks like the stomach lining and all the different layers of, like, imagine I don't know how thick the wall of a blue whale is, for example, but you know, you could probably imagine something like this if it were to petrify. These acorns were sent to me by a subscriber. This happened in about a year, where rainwater was coming down the roof and over the awning and landing in a bucket, and the acorns were in this bucket for about a year and they turned to stone. So I've had so many examples of different anomalous things that have been sent to me by subscribers over the years as I've been looking into all this stuff. It's anything but settled science, right? If biogeology is what we're really looking at rather than the mainstream narratives about geology, then it's a new frontier. You know, we're just at the very beginning, and it's also very complicated because there's an infinite variety of outcomes, because you have all of the different kinds of animal and plant life and all of the different components of that. Then you have varying degrees of breakdown, you know, of decay. And then you have infiltration of bacteria, microbes, termites, fungal intrusion. All of those things are going to lead to different outcomes as well. And so then this gets back to what I started to say before, and I interrupted myself, but geology, when you look at people who know a lot about geology, what they know a lot about are Latin names of a whole bunch of different things, and then narratives about how those things were supposedly formed. And they'll find a narrative for anything you see. You know, you give them enough time, they'll come up with something.
Right.
But it doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
And if it matches up, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor. You know, if this stuff is true, it's self-evident. You can see it for what it is, and it's obvious, but we've all been taught that it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's so strange, and the way this all pans out, I think we're chipping away at a truer version of our natural world with these sorts of big questions. And again, what seem like big leaps in logic at first, when you look a little closer, you know, you've made a really compelling case for all this. And I'm going to look at the stones in my environment a lot differently now. It's funny, Roger from Mud Fossil University, he actually is not too far from the Sleeping Giant Mountain. He tells people where he lives, but I actually live in the same state as him. So I meant to have him
Which state?
Connecticut. I meant to have him on the show, but we just, you know, lost touch. So maybe after this, it'll be an excuse to have Roger on the show. But I've come into that same predicament with geologists where, you know, these ancient stone structures that, or well, hey, maybe they're not so ancient now after today's conversation, but these stone structures I've been looking at in New England, and I'm going to show you one right now, for the most part are unexplained. And when you do find an explanation for it, they say, oh, glaciers push these structures into place, right? So, excuse me. But here it is. This is a stone. What I call it is the bird stone, but it's 11 feet from front to back at its length, and then about 4 feet high on top of another base stone, and it's in alignment with the equinox. So it's something special for sure, but for the most part, it's ignored. There's no sign designating what it is. It's just off the beaten path, just there in the woods. It's massive, massive, and it's limestone too. So, now looking at this with what we've talked about today, I mean, this could have been created with geopolymers to be some sort of landmark and point in a certain direction, maybe shaped it like a bird for a specific reason, or who knows.
To me, the lines on that, it looks like broken piece of a larger structure.
Right.
This is the thing. A lot like people will look at that. You bring it back up on the screen.
Yeah.
And it's called the birdstone, and they're like, oh, there you can see the head and the beak, and this gets back to what I was saying before. If that was really a bird, it shouldn't just all be the exact same kind of stone, right? Because even if that was formed from the infiltration of elements, the infiltration of those elements is gonna be different if it's infiltrating different kinds of tissue. And so for it all to be the same thing, to me, that would be pareidolia. I think that's based on the lines, that looks like a piece of something much bigger. But there's a lot of people that will share something like that, and they start making claims, and they're like, yeah, and here you can see where the wing was, and you can see there's the back leg, and I'm just like, it's got to be. That's why I focus so much on the heartstones, because they were very repeatable.
Right.
They were very specific, and that specificity matched up perfectly with heart anatomy.
Right.
And I never would have anticipated that I'd come across this. You know, it's just something that happened when I started to look at the world with new eyes. When I was a kid, I thought, I grew up with this idea that all the major discoveries of importance had already been made, and that the future lie out in space. And, we had to get off this rock before another asteroid comes and wipes us out, and so I was a big, sci-fi junkie, and Star Trek and Star Wars and all that. And this place is so much more interesting than we were ever led to believe.
Right.
The history has been completely falsified, and the truth is way, way more strange than fiction.
Right.
So.
Absolutely. And to be clear, showing you that was not a case for like this being an anatomical bird. They're called birdstones because Native Americans carved these tiny stones into the shapes of birds, and that's just the closest thing I could find that looks like this. But to your point, one of my family members looked at this picture and they said, oh, the other side of it looks like the face of a bear, right? So yeah, you could go any angle with it, but I think the larger point to make with this is like, here's another case where stone is unexplained. There's all these mysteries around, and whether or not this is a petrified being or not, which again, I don't think that, it still fits into this category of anomalous stone structures that they're ignoring for some reason. And I think it's a big indication that, as you pointed to just now, the world we live in is so much more interesting than we've been led to believe, and these things need to be made sense of, and we're not going to be able to do that unless we're able to let go of all of these biases and factory settings that academia gives us. So kudos to you, Mike. I think you're doing some really amazing work. You're on the cutting edge of this, which hopefully one day will be accepted as reality, this biogeology. I think that's incredible. And you're already a man of firsts, as the first person to be convicted of a hacking crime. So who knows? Maybe that was in a way.
Not the first to be convicted. Well, of hacking. Yeah. No, the first to go to jail for it, not the first to be convicted.
Okay, excuse me. But either way,
dubious honor.
Either way, you do have that prowess as a first in some capacity. So who knows? Maybe this is karma's way of giving you maybe the low end and then the high end, right? You get a little bit of the the negative and then the positive, as the world tends to do.
Yeah, from computer hacker to reality cracker, I suppose you could say. It's been an unusual journey the last 5 to 10 years, that's for sure. I never thought I'd be doing any of this stuff.
Well, and on that note, I should ask you, since we're on the show, does your family think you're crazy for pursuing this interest? Do you have support in that realm, or is this sort of something where the audience is the supportive side for it? Because that's true for my podcast. It was a very lonely venture being interested in all this stuff. And then when I created the podcast, it's like, you build it and they will come. I started making, even in my own personal life, more close acquaintances and friends that helped build up my confidence that, oh yeah, I'm not just seeing this stuff as one lone nut on the world. There's tons of other people who believe it and see this too.
Yeah, I would say most of my ideas, the majority of my family would think are pretty nutty. My nuclear family, my kids and my partner, they've struggled with a lot of the stuff that I've championed over the years, but I think now they're on board with a lot of it. They've seen that a lot of the things that I talked about there's a lot of evidence for them, especially like during the pandemic days.
Right.
I saw through that years in advance, and have been vindicated on everything that I was claiming. So that's reassuring that at least those closer to me are somewhat open. They're not so interested though. They could kind of care less about it, but they're aware of it.
Yeah, tends to be the case with family. Let dad be. Let him be interested in his stuff. Yeah, no, I hear that. Well, hey,
but I think it's important to find the others. Find like-minded people and
absolutely
keep an open mind, but not too far open. And this place, my dad used to say, it's beyond the beyond, and this world really is. The more you dig into things, and it's far less mundane than we were taught to believe. One of the best comments that I've had on my channel over the years is that someone said my videos they're more powerful than psychedelics because they don't wear off.
Right on.
And many people have started to see things through different eyes after watching these videos. So that's cool.
Yeah.
And take it all with a grain of salt. I could be wrong about it all, but I don't think so. There's so much that lines up perfectly in ways that it shouldn't, and so many synchronicities along the way that have all pointed to these things. And
right.
So.
Yeah, no, we see it here on this show too, but I think that's a great place to end it. And for the folks listening, Stellium 7 on YouTube and on social media as well. Is there anywhere else you want to direct the audience before we wrap this one up?
No, it's just the YouTube channel for now. If I can get myself to do it, I'm going to go and market this book that I've written on the hacking subject, and that should be hopefully out at after the beginning of the year. I was going to try and get it done for Christmas, but I have a mental block against marketing.
Well, let us know when it's out and we'll help you out with that. We'll have you do the podcast rounds and talk about hacking, talk about the Stellium 7 content, whatever you'd like. But yeah, very interesting stuff, Mike. I wish you luck on that, and please do come back on the show sometime. I'm sure the audience is going to love it. And I mean, almost 3 hours. This is a long podcast. Shit. I'm really grateful.
I don't pay attention to the clock.
Sometimes guests are always
captive
quick.
Audience.
Yeah, no, the guests sometimes are quick to jump at 90 minutes. So no, I love it. For me, it's just more to work with. So no, I appreciate it, Mike. You're welcome back anytime. And Stellium 7 again on YouTube, and follow up on Instagram and X as well, I think. But anyways, until next episode.
I'm on Instagram, and I am on other social medias, but like Instagram is just whatever random shit I decide to throw up there. It's not necessarily, sometimes it's about my channel and sometimes it isn't. Right. Whatever memes or little video clips I find entertaining. I need to get more active on X because it seems to be a little less censored. I've definitely noticed major algorithmic controls on my channel over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
it grew very quickly and then didn't.
Yeah, well, X is new for me too. I never paid attention to it, but it seems like a place you can get a leg up, and hopefully with the change is coming. We'll see some fair playing ground on YouTube, but who knows? But until next time, support Stellium 7, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Until then, immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the Patreon and the Substack, what an episode with Mike Wilkerson. Maybe you're not sure what to think. Maybe you're fully on board. I don't know. I just watched some traditional geology videos, and I gotta admit, it's a little sketchy still. I don't know. I didn't see Mike taking any slices of the stones and looking at them under a microscope. I think that's a big thing you can do to maybe get a better idea of what these stones actually once were. But I'm not totally skeptical. I think there's a lot of interesting points that have been made, and I think Mike is appearing to hold himself to a pretty high standard. But if you only are listening to the audio side of this, which you are if you're hearing this, go back on the Patreon or the Substack and fast forward towards the end just to watch some of the slides in the video that I shared. And unlike in the past where I was very lazy and slow to post the videos, it really wasn't laziness, it's more just perfectionism, and editing videos takes a lot longer than you would think. Even the smallest little things that only happen within a 5 or 10 second period in a video can take minutes and tens of minutes to hours to complete. Not to mention the file sizes. Exporting those files takes sometimes hours. I mean, sometimes I just get it going and check it the next morning. So I'm not going to do that anymore. I think I'm just going to put the unedited videos on the Patreon and the Substack. That way you guys can check it out immediately. You can see whatever's being shared on the screen. I mean, all I really did to edit the videos in the first place was throw a title screen on it. I mean, that's it for the most part. I never edit the videos because it just takes too long. I don't put nearly the amount of time and attention into the videos that I do with the audio. So, but lucky for y'all, that also means early releases and more content on the Patreon and the Substack. So thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the show. And I hope you go and support Stellium 7 if you liked what Mike had to say. And if you didn't, tell me why in the comments. I'd love to hear why. I'd love to hear cases against this biogeology theory. But so far, so interesting to me. So far, so good. But anyways, enough from me. Thank you guys for tuning in. And until next time, immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.
MFTIC. Yeah. Broadcasting the moon matrix from the lunar surface. They want you confused, like you never knew your purpose. Hopping through the portals, dismantling the machine. My family thinks I'm crazy, I can't believe what I've seen. Memories of a war, the Pleiadians and Anunnaki stuck within the genes of a copy of a human body. DNA fractal, the universe within me. Epiphanies of science is hoarded by the Illuminati. Puppet masters know the power of the mantra. Repeating mad lies till it has an effect on ya. Subliminal messages hijack your perception, tricking the population with holographic projections. We see through it. The system is unraveling. I'm astral traveling through the library of the Vatican on a sacred journey. I embark with the squad, forever spitting truth like Mark on the pod. Gotta know the facts, never hold back, cause I ain't getting caught up in the soul trap. I dissect the fabric of reality, looking for the answers, searching through the galaxy. You might be feeling stressed out. Depression, anxiety is no measure of health. To be well adjusted to a sick society, you don't even know how powerful you are. We the ones who gonna expose the whole facade. I awoke in a deep underground military base. Zero recollection of how I got to this place. Alien corpses floating in glass cylinders. Must have been extracted when they crashed into us. Animal hybrids contained in the cages. A lion with the eagle head. Monkeys with reptilian faces. Losing my mind and I'm feeling desperate. I look around the room and I see no sign of an exit. All of a sudden the wall flickers away, revealing a hangar full of spacecraft. My getaway, I run to the nearest one. See a guard knock him out, rob him for his plasma gun. Hop in the ship, take the controls. They highly intuitive, I figure it out easily. Lift off, accelerate through a tunnel until I see the light. Fly into the sky, get flanked by 6 F-35s. Gotta know the facts, never hold back, cause I ain't getting caught up in the soul trap. I dissect the fabric of reality, looking for the answers. Searching through the galaxy, you might be feeling stressed out. Depression, anxiety is no measure of health. To be well adjusted to a sick society, you don't even know how powerful you are. We the ones who gonna expose the whole facade.